The rescue team furiously worked to pump water from the cave tunnel as fast as they possibly could. 4 young cavers had descended into a tiny water-filled hole in the cave floor, one barely big enough for an adult to squeeze into, and never came back. Now each passing second potentially meant the difference between life and death. Though they were only about 100 feet from the cave entrance, it might as well have been 100 miles as the rescuers raced against time. The families and loved ones of the missing waited and collectively held their breath, praying for a miracle. Would they be able to save the young missing cavers, or were they already too late? This is the story of what unfolded that day in the depths of what was known to many as Gollum's Cave. But it had another name as well, the Cave of Death. Located just a couple of miles from downtown Provo is Y Mountain, named for the large white Y on the mountainside. Just south of the Y lies the entrance to Gollum's Cave, named for the famous Lord of the Rings character. No one's exactly sure who first called the cave this, but it's likely because the eerie narrow passages and water-filled tunnels are similar to how J.R.R. Tolkien described where Gollum lived in the depths of the Misty Mountains. Gollum's Cave had a notorious reputation among locals due to its hazardous conditions and potential for danger and even death, which explains the other nickname the locals had given it, the Cave of Death. Caves are inherently dangerous places. Tight passages, slippery rocks, and a lack of outside light means it's often not a case of if, but when an accident will occur. Yet, despite these risks, the caves keep drawing people to come to explore these underground worlds. Such was the case in the early morning hours of August 18, 2005, when a group made the short hike up into the foothills below Y Mountain and just above what is now the Seven Peaks Water Park. Their destination? Gollum's Cave. The group consisted of 5 friends: Scott McDonald, Blake Donner, Jennifer Galbraith, Ariel Singer, and Joseph Ferguson. Although Gollum's Cave isn't on any official maps, several in the group were from the area and all of them had caving experience, so it's not surprising that they knew where to find it. But none of them had actually been there before. A 6th friend who had actually been there before was planning to join them, but ended up not going, so it was going to be a completely new experience for all involved, and they reached the entrance to Gollum's Cave sometime around 3 a.m. But whether you want to call it Gollum's Cave or the Cave of Death, there is something very important to know. Gollum's Cave isn't actually a cave at all. You see, the area around Provo, especially Y Mountain, has a long history of mining activity. Dating back to the 19th century, miners have been searching for precious metals like gold, silver, copper, and lead. Numerous mine shafts and tunnels were dug in the area, and once all of the ore was extracted, or if it turned out to be too difficult or unprofitable to remove, the mine would be filled back in or collapsed. But more often, they were simply left abandoned. And that's exactly what happened with Gollum's Cave. The one-time mine was left open on the western face of Y Mountain, and instead of attracting miners hoping to strike it rich, it now called out to cavers looking for a new place to explore, just as it did to the group of 5 friends that night. It probably took some effort in the black of night to find the small dark entrance to Gollum's Cave, since although it was a used mine, the entrance itself is a natural cave where early surveyors must have found promising signs and decided to dig deeper. Once the group had found the entrance, they were faced with their first challenge, actually getting in. In order to access the cave, you have to crawl through a small pool of water. But as we'll see, this group had come knowing that they'd have to get wet. On the other side of the shallow pool, the cave turns into a tight passage, which thankfully is at least dry. The tunnel doesn't go far though before it reaches a second obstacle, a fork in the road. Here cavers had a decision to make, go left or right. To the right, the narrow tunnel continues, and here you would find evidence of its former life as a mine, with old support timbers still visible. This path down the southern fork is a short one though, and it soon runs into a dead end, where it appears that the tunnel was caved in. Whether on purpose or by accident though is unclear. The group had to go left at the fork and take the northern path. Like the southern fork, this is also a narrow tunnel, but the northern path runs a bit longer, just 50 feet or so, before it too reaches its conclusion at a dead end with nothing to see. Or is there? Near the end of this tunnel, on the floor of the cave, is what appears to be another small pool of water, just a couple of feet wide at most. But this isn't a puddle by any means. It's actually another tunnel entrance, and this is what the group had really come to the cave to find. This next section of the cave would be the most exciting, but also by far the most dangerous, since to get you through it, you have to gather up all of your courage and take a plunge, literally. Beneath the surface of the small, seemingly insignificant pool is the path to the next section of the cave. But to get through, cavers have to completely submerge themselves in the water and swim. The water-filled tunnel has a diameter of just 3 to 4 feet, so only wide enough for a single person to swim through at once. And you must swim for about 15 feet before it opens up and you can finally surface. The tightness of the tunnel means it's essentially a one-way path. Once your head goes under the surface and you commit to swimming forward, you have to keep going in the dark until you reach the end and can surface to breathe once again. Once you finally do emerge on the other side, you're treated to the climax of Gollum's cave. Another small chamber. Little more than an air pocket, really. It's unclear if this was a natural cave that the miners discovered or dug it out themselves, but it provides enough room for a small group to stand up out of the water and, more importantly, breathe. After that, it's simply a matter of making the whole journey in reverse, swimming back out the way you came and then up and out of the hole in the northern fork's floor. This was the plan for the group that night. They'd swim through the underwater passage, reach the grotto on the other side, and then come back to complete their exploration of Gollum's cave. And so now each member of the group slipped into the water-filled hole, took one last deep breath, and submerged themselves to swim through the dark, narrow tunnel. There's one small advantage in this water-filled passage, though: a rope placed by previous explorers that stretches from one end of the submerged tunnel to the other. As you swim through the dark, you can keep one hand on the rope to guide you to the end. The rope can also be used to signal your progress. A tug on the rope once you reach the other side would indicate that you were through and the tunnel was now clear. The friends started their journey through the tunnel. Well, all except one. For whatever reason, at the last moment, one member of the group, Joseph Ferguson, got cold feet. Perhaps the reality of what it would take to reach the cave at the other end was too much for him, or maybe something else was making him feel uneasy about the trek. But regardless of the reason why, he decided not to join his friends and would instead wait for them at the entrance to the water-filled passage. Joseph would have watched as his friends disappeared into the tunnel, probably shining his flashlight on the water as the bubbles from their breath no longer broke the surface, and watching for a tug on the rope to indicate that they had made it safely to the other side. And then after the last had gone in, Joseph was left all alone, with nothing to do but wait, and wait, and wait. 5 minutes passed, then 15, then half an hour. Sitting alone in the dark with nothing but a flashlight, Joseph began to worry about his friends. What could they be doing in there? Was there more to the cave than they were aware of? None of them had ever been in there before, and this cave wasn't well mapped, so perhaps they'd found another area that they didn't know about, and they were now taking their time to explore it. After nearly an hour had passed, though, with no sign from his friends, Joseph began to worry in earnest. This wasn't like them. Something must have happened. Something must have gone wrong. Joseph decided he needed to get help, even if his friends were fine and just taking their time exploring the cave. If there was a chance that they were hurt or needed help, he couldn't risk waiting any longer. And so, at 6:25 a.m., after about an hour of waiting for them, Joseph made his way back out of Gollum's cave, and he called the police. The response from the authorities was swift. Upon receiving the call, the Provo police quickly mobilized, and since this was a situation involving missing cavers, they enlisted the help of Utah County Search and Rescue. Once they were on the scene, rescuers faced their first challenge: that they knew nothing about the cave itself. Neither Gollum's cave nor the Cave of Death appeared on any official maps, so the rescuers were going in completely blind. But after learning of the situation from Joseph, that his friends had gone down into the submerged tunnel and never came back out, the rescue team started formulating their plan. Donning wetsuits and equipped with sensors that could detect oxygen or other more dangerous gases, they inspected the hole that Joseph's friends had disappeared into. One rescuer remarked that the water didn't seem especially cold, so it was unlikely they had developed hypothermia or that the cold was somehow keeping them trapped. But since they didn't know exactly what they were dealing with, the rescuers were hesitant to simply dive into the same water-filled tunnel to search for the missing group. So instead, they came up with a plan to 1. Get the water in the tunnel out, and 2. Get in some more air in case the oxygen levels were dropping in the small cave at the other end. So rescuers brought in pumps and got to work doing both. Hopefully soon they'd be able to pump enough water out that they'd be able to reach the missing cavers, or that they could even simply crawl back out themselves. They had no idea what happened on the other end of that tunnel. All they could do was hope. But what had happened that night in Gollum's cave? What transpired once the last of the group slipped beneath the water and into the small tunnel? One at a time, Ariel, Jennifer, Blake, and Scott all entered the tunnel at the end of the North Passage. After fully submerging, they swam forward in the darkness. Each followed the rope the full 15 feet to the other end, where they emerged into a small chamber. And it was truly the end of Gollum's cave. There were no other passages, no additional tunnels to explore, just a small space barely big enough for a small group, with just enough room to stand up and catch your breath, or at least try to catch your breath. You see, in order to understand what happened in Gollum's cave, we have to look at what's known as oxygen concentration. The Earth's atmosphere is composed of a mixture of different gases, about 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, with the rest from small amounts of other gases like argon, carbon dioxide, helium, and methane. Your body has evolved to rely on this specific composition, and if that balance is disrupted, it can quickly lead to negative effects. Reduced oxygen levels can lead to what's known as hypoxia, and it doesn't take much of a change. A reduction from 21% oxygen to just 19.5% can start to impact both judgment and coordination, while also causing increased heart and breathing rates. Once the oxygen level gets below 16%, headaches, dizziness, and fatigue all set in as well. If the oxygen dips below 12%, you'll have significant cognitive and motor impairment, as well as nausea and vomiting. And once it's under 10%, you'll experience a loss of consciousness. And then finally, death if exposed to a low oxygen concentration level for too long. This means that it was smart of the rescuers to pump air into the tunnel while also pumping water out. They knew that if the air had gone bad in the grotto and the oxygen concentration was too low, then the group could have passed out and were slowly suffocating at the other end. However, a sensor later revealed that the oxygen concentration of the small room at the water-filled tunnel was 19%, below the normal 21% of our regular atmosphere. Not enough to kill you or even make you pass out, but low enough to cause some serious issues with judgment and overall coordination, and importantly, increase both your breathing and heart rate. But if the oxygen level wasn't enough to incapacitate them, then what was going on? Why did they not come back? After the group of four were all standing in the cave, though there wasn't much to see, they probably spent some time celebrating and enjoying the fact that they had all made it all the way to the end of the cave. Perhaps as they talked and laughed, they didn't realize they were feeling a slight shortness of breath, or maybe they just attributed it to the swim they just made, or maybe they never noticed at all. But it doesn't take long in a low oxygen environment for it to start having an effect. And regardless of whether they knew they were impacted or not, at some point, it was time for Ariel, Jennifer, Blake, and Scott to head back to where Joseph was waiting for them. One of the young women was the first to go. Just like the journey to the grotto, she would have taken a deep breath and gone back under the water and then used the rope to start guiding her back. There must have been a problem though. First, that last breath of air that she would have taken before going underwater wouldn't have been as effective as the one she took on the other side. The low oxygen concentration also means a diminished breath capacity. Even though it was only at most a 30-second swim the first time through, this time with weakness and slight disorientation caused by the lack of oxygen in the grotto, she was probably going much slower. Before she reached the other side, she was likely already feeling a burning in her lungs from not breathing. This could lead her to panic, and in that state she might have let go of the rope and tried to swim even faster toward the exit. But that's where another danger with this cave comes in. The underwater tunnel doesn't actually end at the hole that leads back up to the surface. No, this flooded tunnel actually runs several feet past it. That means that if you lose the rope and you swim past it, you'll find yourself at a dead end, surrounded by rock on all sides with no room to turn around. All you can do is push yourself backwards and try to find the hole that leads to the surface. This is exactly what happened to a previous visitor to the cave, Brian Lamprey. He described how when visiting Gollum's cave by himself, he had mistakenly swam past the hole on his trip back out. When people swim through the tunnel on the way to the grotto, they kick up lots of dirt that hangs in the water and makes it virtually impossible to see, even with a flashlight. So if you lose the rope, there's a good chance you won't be able to find your way back out. Luckily for Brian, he was able to push himself back out of the dead end and pull himself out of the hole, but he was actually lucky that he had been there alone that day, since it meant that when he was in the grotto, there had only been one person breathing up the small amount of available air. So he likely wasn't as oxygen deprived as the group of cavers were, and could keep his wits about him and find his way out. But on this day, the group wasn't as lucky. After the first young woman had gone back into the water, the rest of the group probably waited for her to signal with the rope that she had made it back. But as the minutes wore on without any movement on the rope, and they could likely now start to feel the effects of the slight oxygen deprivation, they were left with no other option. Someone else would have to go. The other woman in the group was next, so she would have repeated the process as well, taking a final breath, dropping down into the water, and swimming forward through the tunnel. At this point, the visibility would have essentially been zero, with even more dirt and debris kicked up from her friend swimming ahead. As she followed her way along with the rope, she wouldn't have been able to see anything at all until she ran into something: her friend. By this point, the woman ahead was likely either drowning or had already died, and her body would have been blocking the narrow tunnel, making it impossible to go around and get to the exit and the oxygen she so badly needed. She may have tried pushing her friend, but she was likely weak and unable to push her friend forward, nor squeeze past her. The two men would have been waiting in the grotto, growing increasingly more confused and frightened as the women gave no signal that they had made it to the other side. And sadly, the same fate would have met the next one to go, as he too would have swam into the tunnel to find that there was a body blocking his path. Finally, the man who went last, at this point probably feeling desperate to get out of this cave, and with a lack of oxygen probably having a noticeable effect, would have had no choice but to follow his friends. He stood no chance at all, as he would have swam right into the line of bodies ahead of him that now clogged the tunnel. With no room to move forward or turn around, lungs aching from lack of air, and dust swirling around from each person who had panicked before him. As the rescue team pumped water out of the cave and fresh air in, they continued to hope and pray that they would find the group of missing cavers alive. But instead, once the water level was lowered, this is how they found them: in a line in the tunnel. First the two women, followed by the two men, all of them facing the same direction, all of them drowned. The bodies of Ariel Singer, Jennifer Galbraith, Blake Donner, and Scott McDonald were removed from the cave, and officials made the decision to seal the cave to ensure that no one could meet the same fate again, with a memorial plaque placed at the entrance. An effort has been made to identify and seal off other abandoned mines like Gollum's Cave to prevent accidents like these. But in Utah alone, there are still likely hundreds, many of which are unmapped and just waiting for another unlucky explorer to fall victim.
A criminal who crosses the line could find themselves facing the gallows or the headsman at any point throughout history, although crossing the line could mean anything from murder to just annoying the king. However, in many places, the death penalty isn't the worst thing that the courts have to offer. Here are 15 of the evil punishments worse than death administered throughout history. Number 15. Flaying. Let's turn the clock back to ancient Assyria, roughly 850 BCE. The ruler Ashur-nasir-pal II was known for his brutal treatment of captives and rebel leaders, but one method created a special dread for victims. Using a special set of knives, the torturers would slowly remove the unfortunate victim's skin, and this was something they practiced a lot. They not only knew how to remove the skin smoothly, but how to keep the victim alive for as long as possible. To ensure this, they'd start the cutting at the lower legs, thighs, and the buttocks, all areas without proximity to vital organs, making it more likely the victim would remain in agonizing pain for longer without bleeding out. This was a highly effective form of torture, and if the torturers wanted information, they were likely to get it quickly. A victim who gave their captives what they wanted could survive the beginning stages of flaying, but the risk of infection would be high. But for most, it was a prolonged and terrible execution. So how long could someone survive a flaying? The combination of blood loss, infections, shock from extreme pain, and hypothermia from exposure to the elements without the protection of your skin means most people could survive few days at the most after being flayed. The skilled Assyrian torturers knew how to remove the skin smoothly, often keeping it in one piece for it to be displayed as a horrible flag of warning. They were clearly proud of their skill, and torture is immortalized in many of their art pieces from the era. And while the Assyrians eventually passed into history, the method became less common but did not die out. It was a common method of torturing religious heretics in empires for more than 1,000 years, and while using it on a human today would be frowned upon, it's still a common skill for hunters who want to keep an animal's pelt intact for use. But that's nothing compared to what the Persians came up with. Number 14. The boats. Flaying usually kills people after a short period of intense torture, but other methods keep the pain going for a lot longer. When a soldier named Mithridates murdered the brother of the king wanted him to suffer. Sure, the king's brother had been attempting a coup, but it didn't matter. He ordered the soldier to be taken to the boats. This wasn't exile, it was something much worse. The condemned could be taken to a pair of boats, with one lying on top of the other. Holes would then be cut in the boat for the victim's head, hands, and feet. So he would be trapped inside. But then the real torture begins, and it starts with dessert. The condemned man is force-fed a mixture of milk and honey, pumping him full of the sweet mixture until he's nearly to the point of nausea, and left in the sun with the sticky substance drying all over his face and body. And from there, nature takes its course. The sweet mixture starts attracting insects, who land on the man's body and begin sucking it off of him, creating a constant feeling of irritation. Joining the flies will be bees and wasps, which will be painfully stinging him. And inside the boat, the man's bloated body will release excrement, which will attract worms and other vermin. Inside the darkened boat, they'll start biting at his body and eventually burrowing in, leading him to die a slow, painful death from his body being consumed by vermin. This technique seems to have only been used in Persia, although it horrified the Greco-Roman historian Plutarch so much that he made a special mention of it in his biography of the sadist king who invented it. Was this just one madman's creation, or was this a common fate for criminals and traitors in Persia? The answer might be lost to history. It wasn't the only time animals were used to bring death. Number 13. Poena Cullae. Roman law was one of the most advanced systems of law the world had ever seen at the time, and that also meant the judges could get a little more creative. When a judge had a suspect in front of him who had been convicted of killing his father, he decided he deserved more than just a simple execution, and there would have been some surprising supporting characters in the mix. First, the convict would have been severely whipped, and his head would have been covered in a sack, at which point he would have been sewn up into a large leather sack. But he wouldn't be the only one in the sack. He would be joined by a collection of live animals, none of them friendly, at which point the whole collection would be thrown into the water to drown, with the idea that the animals would savagely attack the unfortunate man in their panic as they all sank down to their watery deaths. No word on if the animals were convicted of anything. But what animals were chosen for this terrible ritual? This varies, but one thing that seems consistent is that they were all capable of causing pain. One common choice was a rooster, whose beak and talons were capable of dealing out a lot of damage quickly. Also common was a venomous snake, who's more likely to bite when panicked. Not even a man's best friend was safe. A wild dog was a common addition. The fourth varies, but several reports point to a monkey being included, which might seem like an odd choice unless you've been attacked by them and seen how quickly they bite and claw. One thing is for sure, this wasn't a role any of them were auditioning for. While this was mostly a Roman invention, it's reported that it was revived to a certain extent in medieval Germany. There, only a cat and a dog were used, and they fought like, well, you know. Unlike other forms of execution, this one wasn't about prolonging the torture of the victim, it was simply about making those last few minutes before drowning as horrible as possible. But no Roman execution method was more infamous than this one. Number 12. Crucifixion. It's one of the most famous images in religious history, the Christian Messiah Jesus being nailed to a cross for angering the Roman authorities. But while it's mostly associated with religious martyrdom now, it was a common Roman execution method, so common that religious texts refer to thieves and other criminals sentenced for hanging alongside Jesus. And whether you were a rebel rabbi or a common thief, there were few worse ways to die. It served not just as a slow death, but as a warning to others. The crosses were placed in a public square, and the condemned were frequently jeered and tormented by onlookers as they died a slow death. But unlike many of the other methods in the list, crucifixion didn't deal a fatal injury. It just set them up to die from other factors like blood loss and asphyxiation. And the torture started early. The ritual would start with the condemned being forced to bear the heavy wooden cross on their back, often while being whipped. After the cross was placed, they would be nailed to it through their wrists and hung from it. Sometimes the feet would be nailed as well, although evidence isn't consistent. With their arms splayed out to the side, they would be left to hang for anywhere from hours to days. Because their whole body weight was held by their arms, the typical cause of death would be trouble breathing due to the pressure on the lungs. However, elements like heart failure, dehydration, or infection from the wounds inflicted by the crucifixion and whippings can also spell the end of the convict. However long they lasted, it would be an agonizing end. But because this execution method isn't immediately fatal and due to its religious association, today a small group of zealots chose to have themselves temporarily crucified as a penance ritual. At least it's ancient history as a punishment, right? Not quite. It was used in places like Japan and Burma as late as the 1800s, with some isolated reports of it being used to torture prisoners of war during World War II. It wasn't the only method that stood the test of time. Number 11. Immurement. Sometimes the most horrible thing to do to someone is to do nothing. One of the most ancient methods of torture was to take a convict and wall them in alive somewhere and then just walk away. Out of sight, out of mind for those dealing out the punishment. But for the condemned, they're left alone, in the dark, with nothing but their mind to keep them company as they slowly die a painful death due to either dehydration or asphyxiation, depending on how much air there is in the confined space. If the condemned is buried alive in a coffin, as has happened accidentally to people wrongly declared dead, they'll likely be dead within hours from a lack of air. But if they're kept in a larger space, it's likely to be fairly longer and more painful. While this was commonly used as a method of execution, it has also been used for human sacrifice. But one case was more famous than any other. The Vestal Virgins of Rome took a sacred oath to become priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta. They had two main duties: to maintain the sacred fire and to maintain a vow of chastity and celibacy. If they broke the latter, the punishment was dire. They would first be stripped of all their honors and ritually scourged. Their fellow virgins would dress them like a corpse, hold a mock funeral for them, and carry them to a small underground vault. There, they would be left in what looked like a small room, oddly containing a couch, lamp, and even some food. And an area where the vault was built would be filled up with dirt and buried. The horrible ritual was conducted around 10 times over the 1,000 years that the Vestal Virgins existed. This continued as a form of punishment for thousands of years, but how severe it was depended on the circumstances. The murderous Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory was immured within her own castle, but she was supplied with food and lived for 4 years in her palace tomb. Now let's get into the Middle Ages, which were called the Dark Ages for a reason. Number 12. The breaking wheel. Europe loved its public executions, with everyone from murderers to heretics to common thieves facing their turn at some point. But for those deemed truly loathsome, a worse fate than the gallows awaited them. No one knows when the breaking wheel was first created, but the first references to the torture device can be found in literature from the 6th century. The condemned would be taken to a public stage and tied to the floor, at which point the giant spoked wheel would be rolled in. The goal of this first stage of the execution was to exact extreme pain, starting with breaking the legs of the convict by dropping the wheel on their shins. Sometimes this would be followed up by killing the inmate by dropping the wheel on their neck, but this wasn't common because the public demanded more blood than that. In most cases, the poor convict was lifted up once their limbs had been broken and bound to the wheel in agonizing pain. Their broken limbs often let the authorities snake their arms and legs through the holes. The breaking wheel was then raised on a pole, and the inmate was either left to die, beheaded, or lit on fire. The body was often left up for display on the wheel as scavengers had their way, making this resemble crucifixion in many ways. However, there was always a way out. If the convict fell off the wheel while still alive or survived the execution, they were deemed to be spared by God. Their injuries were treated, they were typically pardoned of their crimes, and were in a rare position of being one of the only people to survive one of the worst punishments in human history. The worst punishment often lasted a long time, but few were as disturbing as this one. Number 9. Impalement. How disturbing does a punishment have to be for the man who inspired Dracula to go, "Yeah, I like that, I'm gonna make it my signature"? Despite the association with the infamous Vlad Tepes, the Romanian leader didn't create the punishment of impalement. It had been used since ancient Mesopotamia as a way to punish particularly hated criminals. It was a simple method, but almost unspeakably brutal. A large sharpened stake is taken and inserted up the backside of the unfortunate convict and pushed forward until it emerges through the mouth, almost always causing fatal damage. They were supposed to serve as a message as the stake was then raised and planted in the ground, with the victim still attached to it. In the most brutal cases, fields of these victims were planted as a grim warning to anyone thinking of invading the territory. At least it'd be a swift death though, right? Maybe, maybe not. While poorly trained users would no doubt pierce the internal organs and lead to the person bleeding out in agonizing pain over a few hours, some more modern users figured out how to thread the stake effectively and follow the spine. This caused minimal damage and allowed the person to linger for days, with the record reportedly being 8 days. Wait, did you just say more modern users? Yep, this horrible tactic did not die with Vlad the Impaler. It was used extensively by the Ottoman Empire, most infamously during the Armenian genocide that began in 1915. There are also reports that it was used by the Dutch rulers of the East Indies during the colonial era. Vlad, no doubt, would be proud. This next technique might be the most infamous execution method of the Middle Ages. Number 8. The rack. Most of the punishments on this list are execution methods that get a little too ambitious with prolonging death. But punishment isn't the only goal of torture. Sometimes the torturers need some information, and the old guard was willing to get a lot more brutal than slapping people with a phone book. Enter the rack, a simple device that looks like an old-fashioned washboard. But this device wasn't used to clean clothes, it was used to create pain. The wooden frame featured a roller at both ends. The victim's hands were tied to the top end, while their legs were attached to the bottom end. As the interrogation advanced, the torturer slowly rolled the rack, extending the victim's arms and legs until they could give no more. And it only gets worse from there. Unlike the other methods, the rack doesn't deliver immediate fatal injury. Rather, it deals out slow-level pain that gets worse and worse as the ligaments, cartilage, and bones of the arms and legs are stretched beyond what they can handle. This can quickly break a person down, as their shoulders and hips separate and their limbs are ruined. Even if one was able to escape the rack, it's unlikely they could walk after it did its work. This also kept the person immobile for future torture, such as using hot coals to burn them. The rack was so feared that sadistic interrogators would often use the rack on one person and force another to watch to try to break both of them down. The use of this device mostly died out in the 1600s, but it was reportedly revived in 18th century Russia. But it wasn't the most common method of torture in the Middle Ages. Number 7. Auto da fe. The Spanish Inquisition was one of the most infamous affairs of religious persecution in the world, as the particularly brutal authorities built on the Roman Catholic Church's enforcement of laws. Opposing religion was largely banned. Converts were surveilled and interrogated to ensure they weren't keeping their old faiths, and anyone suspected of heresy was subjected to extreme torture under the authority of the infamous Takamata. And for those who confessed, an even worse fate awaited them. They would be subjected to a ritual of public penance where they would be paraded before the public and abused, wearing garments bearing their accused crimes. Then the authorities would proclaim their guilt or innocence. For some, it would be innocence, as they would collapse in gratitude and relief. But for most, it would be guilty, and horrors awaited them. The punishment would typically begin with public whipping and torture, but it would only end one way. The convicted would be tied to a stake, kindling would be piled under them, and they would be lit afire and burned to death while still alive. It was a horrifying way to die, but the only grace of mercy was that many passed out from the intense smoke before they burned to death. This execution technique is typically associated with witch burnings, but most of those killed by burning over the centuries, from the 15th to the 19th, were either religious minorities or critics of the dogma and tactics of the Inquisition. And it stayed in Europe. Despite persistent rumors, no witches, accused or otherwise, were ever burned in Salem. Not all these punishments are famous, but this next one is no less disgusting. Number 6. Schwedentrunk. The Swedish drink. Sounds delicious, maybe like a lingonberry soda. But for those who were being invaded by Swedish troops during the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, it was no laughing matter. This wasn't so much a traditional punishment as a method of torture and robbery used by ruthless soldiers, many of whom were out of supplies and intended to take them from the locals by any means necessary. It's a simple technique. Force your captives to drink as much as they possibly can, until they give you what you want. If you've ever tried to drink a whole gallon of water as a part of a dare, you know this can get very unpleasant, very quickly, because your stomach can only handle so much. But this wasn't just drinking water. The Swedish troops would tie the person up and use a funnel to pour the liquid into the person's mouth, and the actual substance would be an unpleasant surprise. Sometimes it would be water, sometimes it would be boiling water, causing terrible internal burns. Sometimes it would just be disgusting, like urine or sewage. In addition to the possible poisoning or infection, this could cause the person's stomach to stretch or burst from the massive amount of liquid. For the soldiers who wanted to add a little additional pain, they would then beat the victim's swollen stomach and even stab them with spears. It's no wonder that most of the victims in the path of this torture learned to just give the soldiers what they wanted and pray that that would satisfy them. Now let's head across the pond for something that isn't as funny as it sounds. Number 5. Tarring and feathering. It almost sounds like a cartoon gag. The unfortunate convict gets a bucket of tar dumped on him, and now they're all sticky. And here come the feathers. They look like a giant chicken. But this isn't slapstick comedy. It's a feared fate for those who angered the mob in 18th century America. The tradition might have started much earlier. It was first referenced in an order by Richard I in 1189, but it didn't catch on until tensions started rising in the British colonies in North America. Angry rebels in the years before the Revolution would protest tax laws by kidnapping British officials or suspected informers, coating them in pitch tar and covering them with feathers to publicly humiliate them. It was considered a grave insult and good sport for the rebels. But the truth was actually much worse. How do you get the tar nice and sticky? You heat it up. While this wasn't often the case, often tar poured on the victims was boiling hot, and when it dried and came off, it would take pieces of burned skin with it. There's no report of anyone dying from being tarred and feathered. Many of the victims were left in agonizing pain and had permanent burn scars. The punishment became rarer after the Revolution, but it was hard to keep good torture down. The Mormon founder Joseph Smith was tarred and feathered by anti-Mormon radicals in 1832, and a German-American farmer named John Meintz was subject to the punishment in 1912. His crime? Not supporting war bond sales during World War I, and likely just being a German-American during wartime. This next one might be a bit of a catch-22. Number 4. Trial by ordeal. You've been accused of a horrible crime and the penalty is death. The good news is you can get out of it. You just have to do what? Trial by ordeal goes back to antiquity, when the most common form was trial by combat. This one was actually rather fair. You just go into the arena, fight a guy, and if you come out alive, you're free. Want to prove you're innocent of murder? Just commit this other murder. This would fall out of favor eventually, but elements of it persisted in the duels that became common in the West. But in other cases, the odds were stacked against you. These trials would often resemble torture, such as the accused being sentenced to trial by fire. In this one, the accused would simply have to walk barefoot over a field of hot coals or hold a red-hot iron. Sometimes the person simply had to accomplish the painful task, but more often they would be checked for signs of injury and only deemed to be innocent if they somehow managed to escape without getting burned. The odds aren't looking great here, but one twist on the trial by ordeal was particularly sadistic. When witches were accused and placed on trial, they often proclaimed their innocence. But how do you prove something that probably doesn't exist? Those who trialed the apparent witches had an idea. The accused witch would be tied up and submerged in water to drown. The idea was that the witch would be able to use supernatural powers to escape. So if she managed to escape, she was clearly a witch and would be put to death. So how would someone prove their innocence? Simple. Die. If the accused witch drowned, they were clearly innocent and would go to heaven, according to the dogma. Even when the accused wins, they lose. The next punishment has some accessories. Number 3. Rat torture. How do you turn rats into man-eaters? The first reports come from Roman Catholic writers alleging torture in the Tower of London during the Elizabethan era. They claimed that as the tide rose and the River Thames rolled in, rats would climb into the prisoner's cell and viciously attack him. Some doubt this happened since rats typically don't attack humans unprovoked, but the reports might have encouraged some people. Because in the 16th century during the Dutch Revolt, someone did manage to weaponize the furry plague vectors. A pottery bowl filled with rats would be placed upside down on a prisoner's body, and hot coals would be placed on top of it. As the bowl heated up, the panicked rats would desperately gnaw at the prisoner's flesh to try to find refuge from the heat. Someone called PETA. It's grotesque and it worked. Rat torture isn't a particularly common form of torture simply because it depended on living animals doing what you need them to do, but the fear that rats create made it an appealing option for particularly cruel dictators, and it made an appearance in military dictatorships in South America during the 20th century. Argentina in particular was infamous for using a retroscope to insert live rats into people and letting the creatures dig their way out. It's mostly a horrifying fact of the past, although in 2010, a man threatened his kidnapped victim with rats to get him to grant his wife a divorce. This next torture is especially horrible because the victim does it to themselves. Number 2. Yubitsume. Japan's criminal scene is powerful and secretive, and agents that fall short of a task assigned by their boss often face severe punishment. But unlike the American gangsters who might find themselves wearing cement shoes, members of the Yakuza often face another penance, less deadly but bloodier. In order to atone for their offenses, they must sacrifice a piece of themselves, particularly a piece of their little finger. This is not only extremely painful, but is considered to weaken them because the little finger is key to maintaining the grip on the hilt of a sword. But that hasn't stopped it from being used for hundreds of years. The penitent Yakuza member begins by laying their hand on top of a clean cloth. They then use a particularly sharp knife, called a tanto, and slice off their little finger just above the top knuckle. They then wrap up the fingertip in a package and present it as an offering to the head of the crime syndicate. Why would they want it? Tradition, because not only was this ritual used as a method of penance, but in the past it was used as a form of payment by gamblers who fell behind on their debts. The good news is, if the agent screws up again, they can do the ritual again. The bad news is, they're gonna run out of fingers eventually. Finally, sometimes there's nothing more terrifying than nothing. Number 1. White torture. Solitary confinement is torture in itself, stripping someone of all their comforts and isolating them from any human contact. But usually, they at least have a sense of space that they can use to orient themselves. White torture strips them of even that by placing them in a cell of nothingness. The prisoner is deprived of color, giving them a cell where the walls, floor, and ceiling are entirely white. Not only that, their clothing is also white, and any food given to them, usually plain rice or porridge, is white as well. Taking this to the extreme, the cell is equipped with bright neon tubes that prevent any shadows from falling on the cell. And the soundproof cell leaves them with nothing but their own mind. And that mind slowly starts going insane. An extreme form of sensory deprivation, this was reportedly used extensively in Iran against political dissidents, who could be held for months or even years in one of these cells. It also showed up in Venezuela, and international human rights groups even accused the United States of using it on accused terrorists in Guantanamo Bay, using goggles and earmuffs to block out their senses. But in all these cases, the facilities are tightly guarded, meaning all anyone has to go on is the reports of the victims, and those are harrowing, with many claiming the extreme sleep deprivation left them unable to sleep even after they were freed, and haunted them for years afterward. He was such a nice man, a pillar of the community, said so many people who knew and trusted the man who became known as Dr. Death. Over decades, this serial killer visited the homes of his patients, and when he left, those patients were perhaps too often no longer breathing. But how chronic was his compulsion to kill? At first, it was thought he'd murdered a handful of people, and then it was scores of his victims, with the final number still being disputed. What we do know is that Mr. Shipman could have been the most prolific serial killer of all time. Harold Shipman was known to a lot of people. He was a family doctor in a small community, an agent of help, and over 2 decades he became a man whose face most people recognized in the street. This bespectacled, tweed-wearing doctor that looked perhaps what you'd imagine a small-town British doctor to look like was indeed a pillar of the community. But to say he had a dark secret would be the understatement of the century, because Harold Shipman, aka the Angel of Death, wasn't just Britain's most prolific killer, but he's up there with the most murderous criminals the world has ever seen. He was born on the 14th of January 1946 with the full name Harold Frederick Shipman. To his friends, patients, and colleagues, he was simply known as Fred or Freddy. As is almost always the case with the people we feature in this series of shows, if we want to try and understand how someone became a killer, we might look to traumas in childhood. What went wrong? For young Freddy, that was the death of his mother when he was 17. His friends in interviews years later said that young Fred didn't talk much about his mother's fight with lung cancer and how he watched when the local doctor used to come around to his house and relieve her pain with morphine. But it's thought young Fred was a very devoted son. His mother had gone to great pains to make sure her working-class boy brought up on a council estate, that's like the projects for our American viewers, got into grammar school. Again, for American viewers, this is a school kids had to pass exams to get into, populated perhaps with few poor kids. But Shipman tried in earnest to please his mother, and his mother became very proud of her son. We might also add that some bios said she was domineering and overbearing, sometimes a recipe for disaster. It said she pushed him too hard, and in turn he became isolated from other kids. His mother would foster in him a sense of superiority, but this would become a lifelong problem for Shipman, who perhaps could never get his mother out of his head. Still perhaps trying to please his mother, and with her painful, long, drawn-out death on his mind, Fred was determined to become a doctor. He would dedicate his life to other people's pain. But as we will see, his method of treatment we might perhaps say was overboard, a tad too total. Shipman studied at Leeds University Medical School in the north of England and later took on internships at hospitals. He was on his way to becoming a doctor and a step closer to becoming a serial killer. During this time though, even though it said he was a loner, he would meet his future wife. He was 19 and she was 17 when she became pregnant with their first child. They would have 4 kids in total. In 1974, he would get his first job as a GP or general practitioner. That's basically your run-of-the-mill family doctor. The clinic where he worked was located in a small town called Todmorden in West Yorkshire, which on the outside looks like a beautiful rural town, nestled between valleys, what a poet might have called England's green and pleasant land. But looks can be deceiving, because even though Shipman might have looked like he was living the perfect rural life, he was at that time forging prescriptions of the opioid called pethidine. Yep, he was hooked on a kind of prescription heroin. He was caught and fined, but after some rehab, he was back in business. In 1977, he began working in another small community, this time on the other side of those valleys in a place called Hyde, just outside Manchester. Okay, so we should tell you now that we don't exactly know when Dr. Shipman consummated his curse and became Dr. Death. It's generally thought that he didn't waste much time and was killing when starting out in Todmorden. How many he killed is a number that changes by the source, but it was a lot. Hundreds. But how many hundreds? We still do not know. This might make him the worst serial killer in history, but getting the exact body count is not always easy. There have been a couple of deranged Colombians that might have a stake in the most kills count, and as historians point out, data from some countries might be unreliable. Then you also have some depraved rich Europeans from times past who also took great pleasure in murdering scores of peasants for their amusement. So he's now working in this small Lancashire town. He'll stay there for around 2 decades, and Mr. Shipman, as we have said, will become what's called a pillar of the community. In fact, one of the senior doctors who worked with him said that Shipman would take on a massive workload, and his patients for the most part adored him. He was said to be the most popular doctor at the medical center. What could possibly go wrong? The answer to that is his patients seemed to kick the bucket a lot, perhaps before their time was up. Psychologists have said that he might have murdered some of his patients because of the power it gave him. He became God, and the memory of his dying mother was never far away. But it's said he also murdered when there was money in it for him. In one case, someone's will. He also obtained large amounts of morphine by saying he needed it for patients that sometimes didn't actually need it. According to the Guardian newspaper, most of his victims were old women. That report says his first victim was a 71-year-old woman who Shipman got rid of in 1975. It was the eve of her birthday, too. His youngest victim was a 41-year-old man and his eldest a 93-year-old woman. Killing became easier for him when he left that medical center and started his own practice in the same town. You might well be thinking, how come no one noticed that there was this doctor in town that if you saw, there was a good chance your days were numbered? Didn't anyone say, wait a minute, my mom was all right on Friday and on Saturday she was found slumped over in her chair. And that's what happened to so-and-so's mother. And the other woman too. Well, apparently no one could see past the nice man in a tweed jacket. It wasn't until 1998 that the local undertakers in the town of Hyde started saying that it seemed like a lot of bodies were coming from him. Indeed, it was soon found out that his death rate was 10 times higher than other doctors. On top of that, many of those that died did so in the same position. Like a drug addict that's overdone it. The mostly old women were sat upright or slumped on a sofa, and they were fully clothed. The Guardian writes that the police investigation in '98 was a shamble, stating that police didn't check inconsistencies of his medical notes with the deaths of his patients. The police investigation failed to carry out even the most basic checks, including whether Shipman had a criminal record, wrote The Guardian. But some members of the local community were onto him. Even a taxi driver came forward and said Shipman was killing off perfectly healthy individuals. Then, also in 1998, a former mayoress who had a bit of cash stashed away died in Shipman's care. She left most of this money to Shipman, but the daughter wasn't having any of that. She ordered the body be exhumed, and Shipman was subsequently charged with his first murder. The coroner, of course, ruled that the woman had died of a morphine overdose. What followed you could perhaps call an exhumation sweep. Lo and behold, the notes Shipman had written didn't match what had actually happened. Those bodies showed that morphine toxicity had turned off the life that had once been inside them. The notes also showed that Shipman had often made up a bunch of ailments patients never had, and he'd done that often right before they died. It was also found out that in some cases he told the relatives of the deceased that before the old bean had passed, he'd called for an ambulance, but phone records showed that he lied about that. The delectable doctor was finally becoming Dr. Death. Police and people of the town just couldn't believe what had been happening right under their eyes. It turned out that in just an 18-month period, on one street alone, 6 of Shipman's patients had died in front of him after he'd gone around and done his house visit. It was also found out that in the space of 1 month, 8 of his female patients had died in mysterious circumstances. It said in court he was still possessed with that air of superiority his mother had helped create. He lied, changed his stories, was apparently arrogant and unhelpful, and denied everything, even though there was so much evidence. In fact, in one documentary, Shipman's former cellmate explains that he never admitted to the crimes. That cellmate had tried to hang himself at one point, and it was Shipman that revived him. He took lives, but leaving a dying man hanging in his cell was not his MO. Despite this act of kindness, investigators said he tried to belittle police and acted domineering in interviews. He was treating this as some sort of game, a competition, pitting what he considered to be his superior intellect to those of the officers who were interviewing him. One of those investigators told the BBC, in 2000, he was convicted of 15 counts of murder and handed a life sentence. The town of Hyde was in shock, but the story would soon turn even more grim. A lot of people, of course, started wondering if their aunt, grand, uncle, or cousin had actually just passed away on the sofa in their sleep, or whether the now not-so-nice doctor had given them his most potent life-ending cocktail, the Shipman Sofa Special. An audit followed which produced a 2,000-page report. It was revealed that over the 24 years Shipman had been taking care of people, 500 of those people had died. That report concluded that of those people he had killed 218. Today, it's still thought that the number could be as high as 250. This is the number given in the 6th and final investigation and report. It was said that Shipman was addicted to killing, and his last victim would be himself. On the 13th of January 2004, he was found hanging in his cell. He'd used his bed sheets. The prison was criticized for allowing this to happen, but an investigation ruled the suicide could not have been predicted or prevented. Shipman's wife and children always said they knew nothing about his dark side, but they, for the most part, avoided talking openly to the media.
On the bitterly cold night of November 8, 1983, 3 corpses were wheeled into the Department of Forensic Science morgue at the University of Bergen in Norway. Despite being dead for only 3 days, the bodies were already in a terrible state, but they were nothing compared to the horrors to come. The bodies, referred to in the autopsy report as numbers 1 to 3, had all perished in a fraction of a second, but they bore the marks of unimaginable stress. According to the report, the state of rigor mortis was unusually strong for the amount of time that they'd been dead. Blood had accumulated in the lower parts of their organs, and there was evidence of severe hemorrhaging in the major blood vessels as livor mortis also set in. Their lungs were dripping with edematous fluids, and every organ showed severe tissue damage as a result of gas buildup in their blood vessels. Their livers were enlarged. Their stomachs had undergone some kind of damage you typically see in advanced putrefaction. Their hearts were all in ruins, with destroyed blood vessels full of free-floating fat that had boiled under pressure, described by the doctors performing the autopsy as, quote, like sizzling butter on a frying pan. The same sizzling fat was found in other organs too. Their brains and spinal cords weren't in any better state. The autopsies revealed that the brain matter for each body was unusually pale, their blood vessels filled with more gases and fats that had no business at all being there. Cysts had also arisen in multiple areas of the brain and spine. Some of their bodies bore evidence of microscopic necrosis. In short, they were deader than dead. But then there was number 4, where the first 3 bodies in accordance with standard morgue procedure were brought in on metal gurneys. Number 4 was brought into the laboratory in 4 large plastic bags. When those bags were laid out on the dissection slab, the result wasn't a human as you might recognize it, but an incomplete jigsaw puzzle that may have once been a human. Even for these seasoned doctors, each who had performed countless autopsies in their days, there was something deeply unsettling about the chaos laid out on the table in front of them. Perhaps most of all, it was number 4's severed face, the soft tissue lying against the table like a Halloween mask, staring up eyelessly, skin torn and ruddy, bloated lips locked into a final grimace of confusion. It sent chills down the doctor's spines. It was a parade of horrors. What had happened here? Who were these men, and what could possibly have been responsible for their deaths? A wild animal? The world's most vicious and disturbed serial killer? The answer is almost more shocking than the question. This was all just the result of a mistake that resulted in 0.12 seconds of what might have been one of the most brutal deaths in history. This is the story of the Byford Dolphin incident. From 1974 to 2019, the Byford Dolphin offshore drilling rig was operated out of the North Sea by Dolphin Drillings Holding Limited, performing drilling missions for a variety of different energy companies in the Norwegian, Danish, and British territories of the sea. It bore a 102-man crew and was designed as a deep-sea driller in the Acre H3 series of rigs, and like most offshore oil rigs, it was an extremely dangerous place to work. During its years of operation, the semi-submersible platform saw numerous deadly occurrences. In 1976, only 2 years after the facility was first christened, the rig ran aground in the North Sea on the way to Bergen, and 6 people died when falling from boats during the evacuation process. Decades later, in 2002, during an industrial accident, a 44-year-old Norwegian worker on the rig was struck in the head with a piece of equipment and killed. This raised questions once again about the lax safety regulations on the Byford Dolphin, leading to the voiding of its contract with state-owned Norwegian energy giant Equinor ASA, leading to the campaign losing millions in the process. But none of these incidents are more famous than the diving bell incident of 1983, and it's that incident and its grisly, possibly corrupt aftermath that we'll be exploring in depth today. The use of diving bells in order to transport workers safely from the surface to submerged high-pressure environments and back makes the vessels essential to many of the functions of the rig. The bell is designed to descend from the surface to a target depth at a set rate, which allows the occupants time to adjust to the changes in pressure. For each atmosphere, which is the standard unit of measurement for air pressure, the occupants experience an additional amount of pressure equal to the average amount present at sea level during baseline climate conditions. At hundreds of feet below the surface of the ocean, the pressure reaches a level of 9 atmospheres, which are the conditions that the saturation divers on the Byford Dolphin were working at when the November 5th incident occurred. The 4 divers, whose grisly remains were described in the opening, weren't just any divers. They were saturation divers, first introduced by the U.S. Navy in the 1960s Sea Lab program. This is one of the most grueling jobs in the world, the kind of position that would be most people's idea of hell. But these literal high-pressure specialists are rewarded handsomely for their risky work. These days, saturation divers can make as much as $30,000 to $45,000 per month if you're willing to spend up to 28 solid days up to 1,000 feet beneath the waves. So, how does saturation diving work? And how did following an incorrect procedure end up causing 4 dead divers and 1 dead dive tender? As we alluded to earlier, When divers reach the level of pressure you experience 9 atmospheres beneath the surface, nitrogen starts to dissolve into the bloodstream and soft tissues. Without the proper exit procedures, this could result in decompression sickness and barotrauma. More on that later. In saturation diving compared to normal scuba diving, equipment is used to have divers intentionally reach a point of saturation with the inert gases in their blood and tissue, at which point they'll be able to dive for extended periods before coming back up and undergoing a safe decompression process. Saturation divers are confined in a highly pressured chamber called a diving bell, and they need to stay inside the diving bell for 1 day per 100 feet that they descend into the depths. If you're already feeling claustrophobic at hearing that, you probably aren't cut out for this. It's a job that takes extreme patience, as the divers allow the nitrogen levels in their body to reach a point of saturation. They're made to breathe a gas concoction of helium and oxygen in most cases, which has the bizarre side effect of giving the saturation divers cartoonish high-pitched voices for weeks, referred to by some in the industry as a Donald Duck voice. When the process is complete, they're ready for a long stay underneath the waves to do whatever their employers wish. In this case, operate and maintain the rig's drilling equipment. That is, of course, if everything goes well. If it doesn't, there are a bevy of potential horrible consequences for the saturation divers to look forward to. Decompression sickness, high-pressure nervous syndrome, compression arthralgia, aseptic bone necrosis, and if you're truly unlucky, the exact scenario we're about to describe. While descending to the depths as a saturation diver can be hazardous, coming back up can be just as deadly, especially when your equipment lets you down. As a saturation diver, you'll typically spend the last week of your mission in a hyperbaric chamber, meaning a chamber where the high-pressure environment is artificially created in order to slowly and safely depressurize. Whether this goes well all comes down to the dive tenders, the technicians who operate the umbilical cord between the rig and the diving bell. This is a series of bound tubes that regulate communication and also the gas flow and the pressure inside the diving bell. And if things go wrong with the umbilical, things get real bad real fast. And that's why it's so vital for tenders to know what they're doing and be in control of the situation at all times. During the Byford Dolphin incident, the lead dive tender was an experienced man by the name of William Crammond, working with another dive tender, Martin Saunders. Their job was to disconnect a diving bell safely after 2 divers exited it through a trunk to join 2 other divers in a pair of hyperbaric depressurization chambers. The divers were Edwin Arthur Coward, Roy P. Lucas, Bjorn Javre Bergersen, and Truls Hellevik. In Chamber 1 at 4 a.m., Coward and Lucas were resting at an induced pressure of 9 atmospheres. Bergersen and Hellevik were entering the second chamber via the diving bell, separated from the 2 chambers, and a third chamber that wasn't in use by a clamp that was being operated by the dive tenders, Crammond and Saunders. There's a standard procedure for operations like this, and here's how it should have gone. The diving bell door, which would have been open to the trunk connecting it to the hyperbaric chambers, would have first been closed. The pressure would have then been slightly increased to the diving bell in order to make sure that the door to the diving bell was sealed tightly. The door to the first chamber, now containing Hellevik and Bergersen, would then be closed and sealed, cutting it off from the trunk. The trunk would have then been slowly depressurized until it reached 1 atmosphere, at which point the clamp connecting the diving bell to the trunk could be released, and the diving bell could be removed entirely. It was just after step 2 that disaster struck. The general consensus was that Crammond mistakenly opened the clamp connecting the diving bell to the trunk before Hellevik had closed the door to the chamber, though a later report commissioned by the Norwegian government suggested it was more likely an equipment failure than human error from Crammond. But in either case, everyone involved would pay dearly. The second the clamp was opened at the same time as the chamber door, explosive decompression set in. The 9 atmospheres of pressure inside the chambers immediately equalized with the single atmosphere outside. The diving bell fired off like a bottle rocket, killing Crammond instantly and severely injuring Saunders. Meanwhile, on the inside, the horrific injuries we detailed at the start of the video were being set into motion in a fraction of a second. For Coward, Lucas, and Bergersen, also known as Divers 1 through 3, the nitrogen in their blood enlarged into huge gas bubbles, essentially boiling them alive from the inside, and accounting for the sizzling fat deposits that appeared all over their organs in their autopsies. But Hellevik, who you'll better know as Diver 4, was unfortunately standing right next to the partially opened chamber door.
The rapid change in air pressure forced him through the barely open door in just 0.12 seconds. On the other side, there was basically nothing left of him to find but pieces, some of which were discovered over 30 feet away. The international community was so horrified by what occurred on the Byford Dolphin incident that stricter safety regulations were subsequently enforced on Norwegian oil drilling, including enhanced risk assessment procedures and the implementation of hyperbaric lifeboats. Emergency evacuation vessels were specifically designed to help divers escape a compromised depressurization chamber without further endangering them. The incident also led to the formation of the North Sea Divers Alliance, an advocacy group that campaigns for safety regulations on behalf of saturation divers operating in dangerous conditions in the North Sea. However, the aftermath of the incident was hardly a clean and straightforward response from the Norwegian government. In fact, there were inklings of conspiracy before the mutilated bodies were even cold. A report commissioned by the Norwegian government pointed the finger at Cramond for allegedly opening the clamp at the wrong time, ending his own life and the lives of all the others in the chambers. However, Cramond might have just been a convenient patsy for the system, as someone who is no longer alive to present his own side of the case. The people who lost their family members in the incident hadn't been compensated for their loss, and it seemed as though the government was obfuscating the role they played in the tragedy, enabling the fatal accident by failing to update the outdated diving systems on the Byford Dolphin and not tightening lax safety procedures on the boat sooner. The system, which was already almost a decade old before the incident occurred, didn't have outboard pressure gauges, an interlocking mechanism, or a fail-safe hatch, all of which would have gone a long way toward preventing the explosive decompression incident that happened in the trunk. Crew members of the Byford Dolphin, as well as members of NOPEF, the Norwegian Oil and Petrochemical Union, claimed that the report pointing the finger at Cramond was an active cover-up to avoid taking responsibility and paying the compensation owed to the grieving family members. It wasn't until 26 years after the incident that a lawsuit in 2008 definitively proved the equipment was at fault, not Cramond, allowing the families to finally have some justice and compensation for their lost loved ones. In the aftermath of the suit, Claire Lucas, the daughter of Roy Lucas, said, "I would go so far as to say that the Norwegian government murdered my father because they knew that they were diving with an unsafe decompression chamber." After all this, we probably don't need to tell you that uncontrolled decompression is extremely hazardous to human health. But let's take a deeper look into the science of how these decompression events work. There are 3 different types of uncontrolled decompression: explosive decompression, rapid decompression, and slow or gradual decompression. Understanding each one is crucial for preventing other nightmarish tragedies like the Byford Dolphin incident. Explosive decompression, such as the kind seen in the Byford Dolphin incident, can occur both underwater and in an aircraft. Put simply, explosive decompression is when the pressure changes faster than the lungs are able to decompress, a rapid process that typically takes between 0.1 to 0.5 seconds. The release of force is comparable to a bomb detonation, often causing severe, likely fatal damage to the lungs and other organs, as we saw with the divers 1, 2, and 3, as well as the risk of any free-floating objects becoming deadly charged projectiles. Though no other recorded instance of explosive decompression has caused the body to be ripped apart like that of Diver 4. Then there's rapid decompression. While still hazardous to the health of many pilots and divers, it's not nearly as severe as explosive decompression. It takes longer than 0.1 to 0.5 seconds, causing the lungs to decompress quicker than the environment, and still potentially causing lung damage. Then there's slow or gradual decompression, which, while less immediately dangerous than its 2 counterparts, can still have some pretty deadly effects in the right circumstances. More commonly experienced by planes with a loss of cabin pressure, a gradual decompression can result in passengers and pilots experiencing hypoxia, or a lack of oxygen, and its accompanying negative effects. This had a tragic effect in 2005 during the Helios Airways Flight 522 incident, a passenger plane flying from Cyprus to the Czech Republic that lost cabin pressure, rendering the people on the plane unconscious. Air traffic control lost contact with the plane as it cruised on autopilot before all attempts to save the plane failed and it crashed into a mountain in Greece. All 121 people on board, including passengers and flight crew, were killed, making it the deadliest disaster in Greek aviation history. While the results are thankfully not often this spectacular, changes in pressure have taken many lives over the years, particularly divers. From the far more common result of decompression, the bends,
or decompression sickness. And unlike the far more violent and disgusting death of Troels Hellevik in the Byford Dolphin incident, the general consensus is that it is a pretty painful way to go.
In October of 1347, 12 ships dropped anchor at a Sicilian port. Those who eagerly approached were met with a grisly sight. Almost all aboard were either dead or barely alive, their skin erupting with blackened boils that dripped pus and blood. In horror, the Sicilian authorities demanded that the ships set sail, but though they left, the damage had already been done. The Black Death was now in Europe, and millions would die in what is considered one of the greatest disasters in history. Let's explore how the bubonic plague wiped out at least a third of Europe's population, if not more, in this episode of the Infographic Show. What made the Black Death so deadly? Europe was hit hard by the plague, but it was not hit first. It was also not unaware of a disease that was already bringing widespread death and destruction elsewhere. Before the infested ships arrived in Sicily, rumors of a frightful sickness devastating the populations of first China and then India, Egypt, Persia, and Syria had spread near and far. While no one knew what caused it or why, it seemed to follow trade routes spanning the Near and Far East. Further, when it appeared, it was by all accounts unstoppable. Those struck by the Black Death would begin to swell at the lymph nodes located in their groin area or underarm regions. The growths would soon develop into large blackish-blue egg-sized lumps, or for the even less fortunate, expand to the size of apples. These would then fester and ooze various bodily fluids. Beyond this, those with the disease could develop any combination of a series of additional symptoms. These included fever, pain, chills, sweating, upset stomach, and diarrhea. Almost always, this was followed by death. According to those who observed its effects firsthand, all it appeared to take was a brief physical contact with the clothing of someone who was sick to pass the disease onto another. Though some doctors claimed that it was the spirit leaving the body of the deceased that infected others as it passed by. Obviously, at this point in history, the real methods of disease transmission were not yet well understood. Without understanding it, most were helpless to defend against it. Few areas other than some islands cut off from the rest of Europe by the sea made it through the pandemic plague-free. The rest of the population was not so lucky. The bacterium infiltrated virtually every European city's defenses, and many who appeared perfectly healthy one day could be dead a few days later. It was uncommon, though possible, for someone to survive a week or two before he or she died. Compounding problems further, those with the disease would typically be asymptomatic for the first few days, and so no one would be aware that they had caught it. This meant that successfully isolating them from the rest of society at this point was all but impossible. Those who tried the next best thing to protect themselves by fleeing for the country were not safe there either. The plague decimated livestock as well, and countless pigs, cows, chickens, goats, and sheep who also died a brutal death. This was such a problem that it led to a shortage of wool throughout the continent. While many European areas had a death figure of around 30%, 90% of the Italian city of Florence perished. Sometimes bodies of the deceased remained where they had died, as there were not enough people still living to bury them. Thousands of French villages, in addition to areas in other locations, were left without a single remaining soul. The Black Death had mercilessly transformed them into ghost towns. In some instances, nature eventually took over, and areas that people once called home were reclaimed by surrounding forest. It took aerial photography following the end of World War I to rediscover these locations as places where men, women, and children once lived. Most estimates place Europe's death toll between 50 and 70 million, or around 30-some%, though the CDC claims it killed as much as 60% of the population, which is considerably more. Worldwide estimates typically range from 155 to 200 million. The world at the time was a mere 500 million people, so nearly half of all its inhabitants, or again, according to some sources, even more, were killed. So how was it that the Black Death was able to spread so quickly and wipe out so many, people and animals alike? Well, for one, as previously mentioned, there was little in the way of scientific knowledge in the 1300s. Not only did people not understand the plague's causes or modes of transmission, but there were also countless failures in how those in the medical field attempted to treat treated. It is true that Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death, or bubonic plague, is highly contagious. It can also be spread in many ways, though obviously contaminated spirits aren't one of them. Many believe that in its later stages it had the ability to morph into an airborne strain that could be passed on to a new host via a simple sneeze or cough. However, all strains airborne, or those in the more initial stages that are not, are believed to have been transferred through a flea or lice bite, and many animals, in addition to countryside livestock, serve as hosts for the bacterium and blood-sucking pests. Examples are things like squirrels, rabbits, chipmunks, and mice. However, many in the scientific field have argued that by far the worst contributor to the spread of the Black Death was the urban rat and its flea. Part of the reason for this belief is that rats have been observed to develop symptoms quite similar to those in people, and in cases of a modern-day plague, many people with the sickness had accompanying bites from fleas. Recent outbreaks often follow what's known as rat falls as well, or where rodents die off in record amounts for whatever reason. Thus, the most prevalent theory is that the Black Death all began when rats with the plague died and their fleas then looked for more blood in another readily available source, which would at times be human. Upon being bitten by the contaminated flea, this person would then be exposed to the deadly bacteria. Seemingly in support of this theory, ships during the mid-1300s were commonly infested with the furry rodents who thrived in their dark, moist environment. And following the death ship's arrival in Sicily, the plague continued to spread further, following a trade route pattern, as it had previously in Asia, to other port locations throughout Europe and as far down as North Africa. However, more recently, there have been some proposed tweaks to this rat-based theory. As we just mentioned, the Black Death, after all, is not the only outbreak of the plague in the world's history. There have been outbreaks before as well as after, and those that took place more recently followed a different pattern entirely. Europe's Black Death spread much faster, and as far as historical records are concerned, there was no mention of a mass rat die-off in the days or months preceding it. Now, some scientists suggest that it was human fleas and lice that were the true culprits behind Europe's version of the disease. In this case, fleas would bite infected people and then move on to others one by one who happened to be in their nearby vicinity. They describe the underlying mathematical model that a rat flea spread follows is quite different from a human flea or lice one, and when information is plugged into simulations, the human flea model more closely matched data from 7 of 9 plague-hit European cities. Those with this newest evidence admit that the causes of the plague are surrounded by ongoing controversy. However, whether the fleas were of human or rat variety, it's a blood-sucking pest of one kind or another that likely passed it on successfully and so very quickly. It also turns out that the Black Death may not have been causing mass devastation all by itself. When victims' bodies were exhumed from mass graves in England, anthrax spores were also discovered along with them. If anthrax was occurring at the same time as the plague, this would definitely have made things much worse. Anthrax can not only be passed by coming into contact with sweat, saliva, or tears, but also by mere skin contact. In other words, at the time of the Black Death pandemic, people could have come down with a life-threatening disease of one kind or another in pretty much every conceivable way. It's possible anthrax and other diseases made people extra susceptible to the plague due to already compromised immunity. Also, it's possible that the body count of those claimed by the Black Death included victims that actually died from anthrax or other diseases. Beyond its quick transfer from host to host and the contributions of additional disease, the way the Black Death was treated failed to help and may have actually helped kill victims or spread it further unintentionally. For example, at least initially, medical practitioners would do things such as perform bloodletting on patients with the plague. This is where they cut into the veins or arteries in the neck or arms of those who were sick so that their blood flowed freely. This procedure was nothing new, and in fact dated back as far as to the times of ancient Egypt and Greece. Historical figures believed that to be healthy, the body needed the right balance of blood, phlegm, and bile. Bloodletting was believed to correct a possible imbalance of too much blood, which is what caused the person to get sick. Unfortunately, the procedure appeared to be as ineffective for the victims of the plague as it was for Charles II or George Washington centuries later. While Washington awoke with a sore throat and King Charles suffered suffered a seizure following bloodletting treatment. Both died shortly thereafter. Boil lancing was another technique used as a form of treatment, which was just how it sounds. Someone would essentially lance or stick a pointy object into the boils to drain them of their gooey contents. If this wasn't done, they would only continue to grow larger and, in time, poison their host due to the mass buildup of dead blood and pus. Then again, popping them could also cause death due to toxic shock. Beyond the patient likely dying, the boils contain highly contagious matter and possibly spread the disease yet further. Other methods such as burning of various herbs or immersing the sick in vinegar or rose water were also, unsurprisingly, ineffective. In time, after failure upon failure and in an attempt at self-preservation, many doctors simply stopped accepting patients. Even priests began refusing to perform last rites out of danger for their own safety. Where men failed, nature did little to help either. Not only did people have little idea of how to handle the plague, but they were genetically prone to succumbing to it. Studies of the remains of the European population at the time determined that only 0.2% had a gene that offered them any form of immunity. The other 99.8% had none. Since so many of those who were susceptible to the plague died from it, they did not pass their genes on further to the following generations. Many of those who did have the gene lived on to procreate. This is why Caucasian Americans now have a 15% chance of having some resistance to the disease. This is pretty good news, considering the modern form of the plague is still around today. One encounter via the 12 so-called death ships would go on to wipe out men, women, and children to such an extent that it would change the tide of history. You've been feeling pretty lonely lately, so you decide that it's time to get yourself a pet. But you don't want to be too mainstream about it, so instead of a nice dog or a cat, you opt for a rat. Hey, rats can be cute too, you know. You and your rat, Wilbur, quickly become best of friends, but then one day your best rat buddy picks up an unwanted hitchhiker, a flea. Then Wilbur's flea decides that it'd like to take a chomp out of you, and without you even feeling it, the tiny flea has bitten you and sucked on your blood. For the next 3 days, you and Wilbur continue your best friendship, going on best friend adventures and solving mysteries together. And then on the 4th day, you start to not feel so hot. You chalk it up to all the excitement you and Wilbur have been sharing lately. But as the symptoms progress, you start to feel like you might have the flu instead. Then suddenly, you start growing what look like huge blisters in your armpits and groin, and the tips of your fingers turn black as the flesh begins to die. Congratulations, because you've got the bubonic plague, and much like most of Europe back in the 1300s, you're about to be dead. The plague, or Black Death as it was most commonly known, has its origins amongst the fleas of rodents from the Central and Western Asian region of the world. It's believed that climate change during a period of warming during the medieval ages caused the rodents who carried the infected fleas to flee the drying up grasslands, while those rodents who didn't believe in climate change stayed behind and died. Forced into close contact with humanity, the fleas of these rodents began to feast on our soft, supple human flesh and in return infected us with the plague. Historians believe that the plague killed off many early populations of humans before naturally receding. But what would come to be known as the Black Death kicked off in earnest early in the 1300s. A succession of natural disasters and lesser plagues hit South and Central Asia, which led to widespread famine. Not wanting to be left out of the kill-all-humans party, the bubonic plague arrived in 1331 and is believed to have killed 25 million Chinese people before it finally reached Constantinople in 1347. Mongol raids and travelers along the famous Silk Road are believed to have pushed the disease further and further west. But it wasn't until Genoese traders brought the plague-infected fleas into the port city of Kaffa in Crimea in 1347 that the bubonic plague went mainstream. Pretty soon, the Black Death, as it was known by then, was all the rage amongst Europeans, and by 1351 it had reached as far west as Spain and as far north as Russia. Before the Black Death went out of style, it had killed between 75 to 200 million people, and it's believed that it took the world 200 years to recover the numbers lost to the disease. In the wake of the plague, zealous persecution of various scapegoats blamed for the outbreak led to the death of many thousands more, including Jews, friars, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, lepers, gypsies, and people who get to the front of the line at Starbucks and have to check the menu because they still aren't sure what to order. The plague had such a good time in Europe, though, that it revisited the continent intermittently throughout the 14th and 17th centuries, causing many hundreds of thousands of additional deaths. In 1771, the plague hit Moscow and killed between 50,000 and 100,000 people, or as much as 33% of the city's population. 100 years before that, the plague killed 100,000 in London. Like adventurous European university students though, the plague went global, and between 1500 and 1850, the plague was present in at least one location throughout the entire Islamic world. So you've just gone and gotten yourself infected with the Black Death because maybe modern diseases are just too trendy for you. Why is this the worst thing that could ever happen to you? Well, first, could it happen to you? The answer to that question is no. Humanity has long since overcome the terrible affliction known as the Black Death and is safe from the ravages that once killed hundreds of millions of people. Just kidding. You can totally get the Black Death today. And if you think you're safe in your first world life because surely it's only a disease that strikes at the most remote, poorest regions of the world, you may want to think again. As of 1900, the Black Death has made its way to the United States, when an epidemic struck San Francisco and lasted until 1904, then quickly made a comeback throughout 1907 and 1908. While that was over 100 years ago and we have developed many drugs and treatments for the plague, just in October of 2017, the deadliest outbreak in modern times hit Madagascar and killed 170 people while infecting thousands more. But that's an island off the coast of Africa, and San Francisco was over 100 years in the past. Surely we're safe today. Once more, no, absolutely not. And in fact, the western United States is one of the largest geographic areas where the plague is reported in wild animals and livestock alike. So keep that in mind next time you decide to hit up a petting zoo. But what about the plague is so terrible? Well, before we tell you, we'll warn you to go ahead and finish eating if you were eating, or to cancel any lunch or dinner plans you may have had coming up, because we doubt you'll have the appetite after this episode. It starts off with a flea bite, or perhaps a bite from an infected rodent, and then suddenly your body is host to a nasty little bacteria called Yersinia pestis. Our bodies, however, have had plenty of exposure to the plague by now, seeing as Yersinia pestis' favorite historical pastime was to murder all humans, and so the body has learned to very quickly recognize Y. pestis from a unique molecule in its outer membrane. Unfortunately, sometime in the past, Yersinia pestis caught on to this fact, and now when it detects a temperature of about 98.6 degrees, the bacteria figures that it's inside a warm-blooded mammal. This triggers Y. pestis to modify the structure of the giveaway molecule, effectively blinding your body's immune system to its real identity. With your immune system fooled, Y. pestis makes a mad dash for your lymph nodes, which seems like an odd choice for an invading bacteria because your body's lymph nodes are basically immune system fortresses and constantly looking for foreign invaders to wipe out. For any other bacteria, this would pretty much be a suicide run, but Y. pestis is basically the SEAL Team 6 of bacteria. Your body immediately tries to stop the bacteria with white blood cells, the cells responsible for immune system response. But Y. pestis responds by shooting these responding cells with an appendage that injects toxins directly inside the cell's membranes, destroying it. After owning the crap out of your immune system, Y. pestis needs to recover by getting a hold of some iron, and luckily for it, your body is chock full of it. Unfortunately for the bacteria, all that precious iron in your body is wrapped up in hemoglobin and other proteins. Or unfortunate for you, really, because if you've learned anything by now, it's that Y. pestis gets what it wants when it wants it. While it holds the fort down in your lymph node, each bacteria releases a molecule called Yersinia bactin, which is a very high affinity for iron. The molecules cruise through your blood system on the lookout for a specific iron-rich protein in your body called transferrin. Once the molecules find some transferrin, they literally rip the iron away from the protein, destroying it in the process and bringing it back home to Y. pestis. By now, the plague is happily making your lymph nodes into its new home, kicking up its feet and replicating out of control thanks to a rich supply of iron. At this point, you're definitely feeling under the weather, with general flu-like symptoms, but if you're like most people, you ignore these symptoms and push through without going to a doctor. In this case, your failure to get checked out will be fatal. As with modern medicine, the plague can be cured in over 90% of cases if caught early. If not, well, your odds aren't very good at all. At this point, your lymph nodes will begin swelling up, which create the iconic buboes so characteristic of the bubonic plague. These look like very large blisters and can appear on the arms, leg, groin, and armpits, can grow to be as big as an apple. By now, you're going to have a really high fever and might even be vomiting blood. And if any of those buboes burst open, you'll be oozing pus and other disgusting fluids from the open source. This can be extremely dangerous because buboes that are burst open can lead to secondary infections from other bacteria. But luckily for you, you'll be dead long before any of those infections can properly set in. Gangrene can also set into extremities, and fingers and toes can blacken as the flesh dies and eventually falls off. Incredibly, it's not the plague that kills you though, but rather your own body that does the deed. With Y. pestis bacteria throughout your bloodstream, your immune system totally loses its cool and triggers a condition known as septic shock, causing your blood vessels to leak, which lowers blood volume, clotting, and eventually organ failure. Luckily, though, modern medicine is able to cure a plague if caught quickly enough, though many doctors today worry that the plague will very quickly begin to develop an immunity to most of the drugs we use against it. This has prompted a renewal of the arms race that has lasted for millennia between man and bacteria, and it's hoped that new vaccines and antibodies can be developed to stop the plague before it kicks off another world tour and leaves millions dead in its wake. Where in the past, the remote nature of most human villages and cities made it difficult for the plague to be transmitted and thus limited its lethality, today's hyper-connected world would let the plague travel around the world in as little as a day, and an outbreak that started far overseas could be in your neighborhood by that evening. In fact, it might already be there, and we might all be on the verge of the next huge outbreak.
This year in many countries throughout the world, the flu has been deadly. The CDC reported that in America it has been unusually active, and in January it was revealed that the virus was killing around 100 people every week in the US. In the UK, they've had the worst flu season in many years, but it's also been a global concern, with countries all over Asia and Africa experiencing what many are calling one of the worst global flu outbreaks in a long time. So much so that scientists said it's imperative to create a much more effective universal influenza vaccine. We might regard ourselves as fortunate though, based on what you're about to hear. In this episode of the Infographic Show, could the Black Death happen again? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, what is or what was the Black Death, also known as the Plague? Well, it was one of the worst pandemics in history, killing somewhere between 75 to 200 million people in Europe and Eurasia in just a few years from 1346 to 1353. After it was done, something like 30 to 60% of Europe's population had been wiped out, with many others dying in other parts of the world as well. In fact, it killed so many people, it took centuries for the world's population to stabilize. It also made comebacks in Europe later on, such as the Great Plague of London from 1665 to 1666, but the 14th century Black Death was the worst pandemic the world has ever seen in terms of loss of life. It's thought it made its way to Europe on Genoese trading ships. The ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina, only for those who came to greet them to be faced with a nasty surprise. Most of the occupants of the ships were either dead or dying. It's thought the ships had been to parts of Central Asia, and there it said rats carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis came aboard the ships. Fleas on these rodents were the vectors that passed the disease to humans. Authorities in Sicily soon ordered all the death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late, and soon people all over Europe were getting infected. It spread so easily because it was airborne, which meant coughing or sneezing was enough to spread the disease around. So, what's it like to get down with a dose of Black Death? During the pandemic, an Italian poet called Giovanni Boccaccio described it like this. At the beginning of the malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils. These eggs that he describes are called buboes. Once they appeared, soon after the victim would have a very high fever, usually start coughing up blood because of lung infection, and between 2 and 7 days, it was often game over. If you got it, you most likely died. But not everyone did, and true to Nietzschean philosophy, what didn't kill them made them stronger. Studies have found that those who survived became healthier. It's believed the plague had a mortality rate of 30 to 75%. It was a time of chaos as whole communities lived in fear. Doctors didn't want to treat the infected for fear of being infected themselves, while mobs were busy ascribing the blame to any minority such as lepers, Jews, foreigners, or even people with acne. Entire Jewish communities were destroyed and thousands of Jewish people were murdered. You get the picture. This was a grim time to be European. As we said, it came back many times, but never as virulent as those years in the 1300s. What might surprise you though, is that the bubonic plague is still making appearances around the globe. It killed 10 million in China in the 19th century, more than 1,000 in Australia in the early 20th century, and over 100 in San Francisco, also in the early 19th century. It's thought that in 2017, around 202 people died in Madagascar from the pneumonic plague, according to the WHO. This was from 2,348 confirmed, probable, and suspected cases. Fewer people died, of course, because of modern medicine and healthcare. By the way, there are 3 kinds of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. The difference is in how it infects you, with bubonic getting your lymph nodes, hence the ugly eggs, pneumonic gets the lungs, and septicemic is an infection in the blood. You can be treated for a pneumonic plague with antibiotics, but left untreated you will surely die. Most modern cases have been in developing nations, but there have also been some cases in the USA. In fact, in 2015, 16, and 17, a handful of bubonic plague cases occurred in the country. The CDC reports that more than 80% of United States plague cases have been the bubonic form. It stated that from 2000 to 2016, around 7 cases of plague occurred in the country every year, and most of those were in the rural West and some in northern New Mexico and northern Arizona. The worst year this century for the US was 2015, when 15 people were infected and 4 of them died. Also, according to the CDC, the Europeans are now in good shape, with the department stating that all continents report instances of plague except Europe, Australia, and Antarctica. The advice given by health professionals if you want to stay plague-free is don't get bitten by fleas and don't mess with rats or other animals that could carry fleas. Easier said than done. In 2014, a man from Oregon was infected with plague after his infected cat bit him. News media reports that he had lumps under his arms the size of lemons, his hands and feet turned black due to gangrene, and he was in a coma on life support for a month. He told The Guardian, "I had collapsed lungs, my heart stopped, and my hands and feet turned black. Technically, I shouldn't be here." He was so violently sick because he had all 3 kinds of plague. His cat didn't fare well, and it ended up being buried in the garden before the man got really sick. The man lives a full life again, minus most of his fingers and toes. So now we come to the essential question: could there be another massive plague outbreak? The answer is that it is very unlikely because we can treat it before it spreads. Most of us these days don't live in rat-infested squalor, as many Londoners did back in those bleak times. When the Smithsonian asked the scientist this question, he, like most others, said an outbreak was unlikely. What was possible, though, was a plague-based bioterror weapon that spreads the disease. Yes, our wonderful species has in the past created plague bioweapons, with some of the guilty countries being Japan, the former Soviet Union, and the United States of America. Despite being one of the most exciting and rich periods in history, the Middle Ages were a tough time to live in. Among other horrible things, that time period experienced a plague that wiped out 75 million folks across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, high infant mortality, famine, and battles. Add to that a social infrastructure that was frankly shocking, and 0 social welfare. But just how dangerous was it to live in the Middle Ages, and what would your chances be of actually surviving the period? That's what we'll find out today. In this episode of the Infographic Show, most common ways people died in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, or medieval period, lasted from the 5th to the 15th century. It began with the fall of the Roman Empire and led into the Renaissance and Age of Discovery. This period predates the discovery of penicillin and germ theory, meaning that death by disease was a common occurrence among medieval people. Poor health conditions and malnutrition added to the problem. Diseases and conditions common to the period were dysentery, gonorrhea, influenza, leprosy, malaria, measles, smallpox, typhoid, and puerperal fever. In the Prussian town of Elbing in August 1349, the Black Death was first recorded, and this terrible illness has long been associated with death in the Middle Ages. Studies have shown that people around this period had a life expectancy somewhere in the 30 to 40s. That piece of data is, according to some sources, misleading, as the life expectancy rate was dragged down significantly by the high infant mortality rate caused by death at childbirth and disease in infancy. Many people did in fact live to 60 or 70 years of age or older during the Middle Ages. Enrico Dandolo became the Doge of Venice at the age of 85 and died old and blind at 98 in the year 1205. However, death by childbirth was a serious problem as hygiene was yet to be fully understood. Both the rich and poor died in childbirth. Queens often died while giving birth to future princes and princesses, thus greatly affecting lines of inheritance and courses of history. Richer families could usually afford to hire a wet nurse if the mother died during childbirth, but peasant families were forced to be more inventive by soaking bread in milk for the infant to ingest, or even soaking a rag in milk and letting the child suckle from the rag. Death arrived to children in the shape of germs and viruses that people in the Middle Ages had no idea led to disease, having had no knowledge of germ theory. There were no antibiotics or vaccines to protect the most vulnerable members of society, the very old and the very young. The death rate for children was horrendously high, and to survive birth and infancy put one in good stead for the pursuant obstacles this tough period in history brought. Poor medical care, weak immune systems, infectious diseases, and hunger killed countless of people during the Middle Ages, but perhaps no event was as undeniably devastating as the Black Death. 1/3 of the population of Europe between 1347 and 1352 were wiped out by bubonic and pneumonic plagues that ravaged the region. This outbreak was probably the most deadly force, the most tragic pandemic event to have swept through a populated region, killing at least 75 million people throughout Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. If we factor in that the population of Europe was thought to be around 70 million in 1350, then yes, the plague was responsible for a huge number of deaths. And if we were living at that time in Europe, many of us would have become part of the estimated 50% of Europe's population who fell victim to it. And then there were those who died on the battlefield. Hacked and cut with weapons, and with no means to properly clean infected wounds, soldiers often led short, brutal lives. However, casualties in medieval battles were often surprisingly light. Once one side had lost 5 to 10% of their number, noblemen and officers were often held to ransom. Many army casualties were slayed by disease, foodborne poisoning, and septicemia instead. Amputations were not to be taken lightly, and many died from contamination and dirty surgical instruments. Anesthetic was unheard of, and if drinking enough alcohol wouldn't stop the screams, you may have been knocked with a blow to the head instead. Those higher-ranking officers, who were able to access the cutting-edge medical science at the time, enjoyed leeches applied to wounds, or perhaps a course of bloodletting. Traveling was no picnic either. Finding a safe place to stop while traveling was troublesome, and folks often had to resort to sleeping out in the open, running a risk of freezing to death in the winter or being robbed or killed on the road. Food was also hard to come by on the road, and the traveler was often forced to forage, steal, or go without. Lack of foreign languages could be problematic, and travelers may find themselves caught up in local disputes or battles, and things weren't much better at sea. While it was faster to travel by sea, boarding a vessel put the traveler at risk of sudden storms or shoddy navigation. The ships themselves weren't particularly safe until later in the Middle Ages, but on land or at sea, life certainly wasn't a breeze during this fascinating period of history.
A capital crime, as you probably know, is an offense that is punishable by death. The term comes from the Latin word caput, which means head, and capital punishment originally meant literally losing your head. This controversial kind of punishment is still retained in 58 countries, while 102 countries have it but don't use it. 32 countries have abolished it altogether, with another 8 countries saving it for only special crimes. An example would be genocide. In most countries, it's saved for the most heinous of crimes, such as murder, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. But if we look at the ever-progressive Saudi Arabia, you could lose your head over there for adultery, robbery, witchcraft, homosexuality, and according to the BBC, even repeated drug use. Though we guess even just being a journalist will do it nowadays. But if you think that's crazy, well, listen to this episode of the Infographic Show, Capital Crimes of the Past. We'll start with Europe and move on to the USA later. If we look at the UK, a place where once upon a time you could have your limbs pulled off, your internal organs ripped out, and any other manner of awful punishments happen to you, you could say things have vastly improved. The last time they had an execution in the UK was on the 13th of August 1964, and that was the hanging of 2 men, Gwen Evans and Peter Allen, for stealing a few quid from a man and bludgeoning him to death in the process. The Guardian writes that there was no public outcry, and the event only got a couple of lines in the British press. Nonetheless, that was that. The Labour government wanted the end of capital punishment in the UK, and it was abolished in 1965. It remained somewhat legal for certain punishments such as treason until 1998, but no one was hanged during that time frame. Believe it or not, when England introduced drop hanging in 1783, it was seen as quite humanitarian and a move forward in terms of morals. It was the same time in France when it introduced the guillotine for capital crimes in 1792. The reason for that, of course, is that it was supposed to be quick and painless, rather than long and drawn out, excuse the pun, torture that ended in death. It wasn't until then that hanging replaced burning at the stake as the punishment for treason in England, while the Scots burned their supposed witches for a while longer. This was progress, times were moving on, and the historians tell us that the English were not so frivolous in their executing. We're told that during King Henry VIII's reign, there were 10 executions every week in London. The writer Steven Pinker writes that people in those days might be executed for as little as stealing someone's cabbages. If we look at the list of UK capital punishments in England as late as 1822, the barbarity of present-day Saudi Arabia comes to mind. That year, we saw the very last hanging for shoplifting in the country. How many of you have lifted a candy bar in your lifetime? An execution for witchcraft was no more. Still, you might find yourself in the gallows after a minutes-long trial with the judge telling you that you'll be hanged by the neck until dead for what might seem like today's minor offenses. Of the 222 capital offenses, there was cutting down a tree, poaching, robbing a rabbit warren, begging if you were a soldier or sailor, damaging Westminster Bridge, pickpocketing, stealing from a shipwreck, maiming cattle on purpose, being in the company of gypsies for more than a month, strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14, being out at night with a blackened face, stealing horses or sheep, arson, forgery, fraud, letter stealing, rioting, and sacrilege. We can find only one person who was hanged for the latter from 1723 to 1820. We should add that the U.S. National Institutes of Health tell us that across England, Wales, and Scotland, there were contrasts in how this punishment was applied. It seems by far the south and southwest of England saw the highest rate of hangings. Property offenses such as burglary ended with thousands of executions in England over a few decades, but few in Scotland and Wales. We might also add that, of course, murder was a capital offense, but that's a given. Not everyone convicted of capital offenses went to the gallows. We're told that there was a golden age of what is called the Bloody Code, and this was from 1816 to 1820. 5,583 sentences of death were handed down, and yet only 518 people were hanged. It's said that many were pardoned, while others joined the army or navy or were sent to Australia to eke out an existence there. Thankfully, from 1822 and through to the 1830s, many of these capital offenses were removed. One of the reasons for the change was the introduction of police forces, which were supposed to help reduce crime rather than the old tactic of just preventing crime by scaring people with the consequences. By 1861, there were just 4 capital offenses. They were murder, high treason, piracy with violence, and arson in the royal dockyards. We're not exactly sure, though, what would have happened to you then if you went out robbing rabbits from warrens with your close gypsy buddies. We might also remember, in view of what we see as absolutely heinous and despicable today, is that England in the 19th century there was still a capital crime of committing the detestable and abominable vice of buggery with mankind or beast. Yes, that includes mere homosexuality. The last Brits hanged for this were James Pratt and John Smith. Their execution was on the 27th of November, 1835. The reforms after 1822 weren't exactly humanitarian across the board. Our American viewers must now be thinking that those Brits were a brutal lot, but those living in the New World were not always that far removed from such brutality. America had its own terrible laws. While it's hard to find exactly how many homosexuals were executed in the US, even after its independence from Great Britain and the creation of new laws, it seems the country wasn't all that progressive. One academic that wrote a paper on this says it appears that in 1776, male homosexuals in the original 13 colonies were universally subject to the death penalty, and that in earlier times, for a brief period in one colony, lesbians had been liable to the same punishment for relations with other women. We just can't find any instances of the death penalty being applied for homosexuality back then. We do know that Thomas Jefferson thought that he was being forward-thinking when in 1779 he tried to create a law in Virginia which meant that men convicted of sodomy would be castrated rather than executed, but his idea was rejected. Okay, on to the USA and its past capital punishments. But first of all, what are the present capital offenses, as the country hasn't given up the ghost just yet on killing people for crimes they committed? We're told that there are currently 41 such offenses, and you all know the obvious, such as murder. This list contains many instances of how such a murder can happen, such as murder at an airport or in a drive-by shooting. But you can add to that list destruction of aircraft, motor vehicles, or related facilities resulting in death. Espionage, death resulting in destruction of government property. Genocide, mailing of injurious articles with intent to kill or resulting in death. Large-scale drug trafficking. Treason. All of the others just about are related to the willful taking of life. Even today, many people receive the death penalty, but many of those people are not executed. We're told that since 1976, 7,800 people in the USA have been sentenced to death, and just over 1,400 people have been executed. As of April 2018, there are 2,743 people residing on death row. We should add that some states, 20 at the time of writing, have abolished the death penalty altogether. Back in colonial times, before America gained its independence, you can of course compare capital offenses to those of Great Britain. Historians tell us that you might be sent to the gallows in the 1600s and 1700s in the US for witchcraft, stealing food, heresy, trading with the local Indians, or when slaves killed their masters or masters' wives or family, traitorous denial of the king's rights, kidnapping, perjury in a capital trial, or striking one's mother or father upon complaint of both. Another historian tells us that you can add to that horse theft, counterfeiting, adultery, arson, bestiality, piracy, slave revolt, concealing birth, and burglary. From 1600 to 1700, the execution rate for crimes other than murder kept dropping. But even after 1776, when the US gained its independence, there were still quite a lot of people being killed for their crimes when those crimes were not murder. Not all states were the same. We're told that some states were much more lenient. But then we found a list of capital crimes in North Carolina in 1837. These included many crimes we have already listed, but also highway robbery, dueling where death occurs, castration, hiding a slave with intent to free him, bigamy, that's marrying while married, circulating seditious literature among slaves, inciting slaves to rebel, taking a free Negro out of state to sell him, and also the vague crime of causing mayhem. Some states were way more progressive, having heeded the warnings of European Enlightenment writers in the past. Things were changing, such as many social critics writing that public hangings should be ended. Like in the UK, these live executions drew in large, sometimes rowdy crowds. Then in 1846, Michigan became the first state to abolish capital punishment. Wisconsin followed a year later. There were caveats though, such as you won't get executed as long as you don't perpetuate treason against the state. There was a kind of breakthrough in 1972 when the Supreme Court ruled that capital punishment was a cruel and unusual punishment, and for 3 years it looked like an end to such punishment. Of course, things changed. From the beginning of 2018 to December 5, 2018, a total of 22 people in the USA were executed for their crime. The last one was in Texas, and the now dead man's name was Joseph Christopher Garcia. He'd escaped from prison in the year 2000, and he was accused of going on a crime spree after the escape with 6 of his fellow escapees. During that spree, he was said to have killed a police officer during a robbery on Christmas Eve. He denied this, but all men except one that committed suicide were handed the death penalty. Only 2 were still alive and waiting execution.
Do people actually get sucked through airplane windows? Did a bunch of Russian peasants really kill a real-life zombie? How did a Nintendo console once end up causing someone to die in extreme pain? And did you know something as harmless as carrots and cute little house cats can kill? All will be revealed in arguably one of our strangest shows yet, and that's saying something. Number 18. No one really likes cockroaches. After all, they come after dark and start using your house as if it were a free hotel. The good news, while cockroaches do sometimes bite, the mark doesn't usually do anything other than cause a bit of itching. You'd be unlucky to get an infection, although we won't deny that those little space bugs can leave disease-causing bacteria all over your food. Still, not many people throughout history have died directly because of a cockroach. That's why death by cockroach deserves a place on this list. His name was Edward Archbold, and in 2012, the world media reported that this Florida man had indeed succumbed after getting on the wrong side of a cockroach, or some cockroaches. He'd attended an event at Deerfield Beach in Florida to promote a local pet store, and with a bunch of other folks he entered a food eating competition. Basically, they had a time limit in which to stuff down as many cockroaches as they could, but this unlucky 32-year-old man choked on the things. The cause of death was asphyxia due to choking and aspiration of gastric contents. Had he won, he would have gotten himself a pet python, but when arthropod body parts clogged up his throat, he couldn't breathe. All other 29 competitors came away unharmed. This is the only death from choking on a cockroach that we can find, although choking on hot dogs at eating competitions happens more than you'd think. It happened to a young woman in 2021 in the US as she was trying to raise money. A guy choked on a bunch of pies in Australia in 2013, and in more recent years there have been choking deaths at such competitions involving pancakes, cakes, and tacos. Actually, choking on food is hardly a rare kind of death, but choking on a cockroach might be a one-off. Alright, let's now talk about one of the most frightening diseases the world has to offer. Number 17. Can you imagine turning to stone, or what seems like turning to stone? Your entire body gradually starts to harden, making movement hard for you and in time making life impossible. It happens to very, very few people in the world, and it's called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressive, or in more simple terms, Stone Man syndrome.
In short, because of a faulty gene mutation, the body doesn't repair normally. Instead of just going about its business like it does for everyone else, when a sufferer's body gets injured, and that could mean a very minor injury, tendons, muscles, ligaments, and other tissues ossify. That means turn solid. Like something out of a superhero movie, new bones form. But instead of the person becoming stronger, they lose the ability to move. They turn into stone. And there's no treatment for this. Only around 1 person in 2 million will get this, but when they do, life can be incredibly hard. A guy in the UK named Joe Such has it as we write this. He explained, imagine breaking your arm and you're in a cast, but it's permanent. Bones are just growing and locking my body into place. I can't get surgery because more bones will just grow. That's the most messed up thing about this disease. If any surgeons go in there, the body might see this as more damage and further exacerbate the problem. For this reason, most sufferers are confined to a bed by the time they're 20, or at least a wheelchair when they have to leave the bed, and many die around the age of 40. We'll come back to diseases, but first let's talk about accidents again. Number 16. Okay, so we expect many of you have put some of your hard-earned money into a vending machine only to watch that deviant spring unfurl and not let go of that item you so dearly want. Or drop it into the abyss, not the trough. It's annoying as hell. We've been there. We know your pain, but A, should you walk away and get help, or B, should you attack the insentient Hulk with all your might? As you know, the correct answer is B, A. But hey, after a long day in the office writing infographic show scripts, sometimes one allows the red mist to take over. That doesn't usually end well. We know this partly because of a research paper published in the Journal of American Medical Association called Soda Pop Vending Machine Injuries. Here is some text from the paper. 15 male patients 15 to 24 years of age sustained injuries after rocking soda machines. The machines fell onto the victims, resulting in a variety of injuries. 3 were killed. The remaining 12 required hospitalization for their injuries. It seems not all the deaths were related to the machine not giving out paid-for items, but someone trying to get a freebie. All the deaths happened at various U.S. Army bases in the world, since that's where the researcher focused his study. The injuries included someone losing a toe, someone's bladder getting punctured, a fractured skull, and a few broken bones. But the researcher said it was common knowledge in the barracks that the machine that crushed the victim would dispense a free soda if rocked vigorously. The same guy updated his study with the next one mentioning 15 U.S. deaths, all male except 1. In fact, the word on the street is 3 or 4 U.S. citizens die each year after messing with these massive machines. So guys, just leave them alone. Accept the failure. Don't try to cheat. Some of them weigh 750 pounds. They can't be bargained or reasoned with. They don't feel remorse or fear. And if you mess with the wrong one, they will terminate you. Alright, this next guy's death maybe shouldn't be on this list, but the man himself, he should. He deserves to be talked about forever. Number 15. When a man named Frano Salak did karaoke and sang "I Will Survive," people listened. What's interesting is not so much how this guy died, but how many times he almost lost his life in very rare circumstances. In 1962, a train he was traveling on derailed, and after falling into the water, he was fished out and survived while 17 others died. He only suffered broken bones and hypothermia. In 1963, he took a flight in his native Croatia to see his sick mom. A door malfunctioned while he was in the air and he was pulled out, only to land on a haystack and survive. 19 others weren't so lucky. A few years later, a bus he was traveling on crashed and it veered off into a river. Again, he got out, but 4 others didn't. He later had 2 car accidents and both times the vehicles blew up, and both times he survived. In 1995, he was walking when he was hit by a bus, and he came out of that with just cuts and bruises. And a year later, his car was hit head-on by a United Nations truck. He was thrown through the windscreen over a cliff, but survived by grabbing hold of a tree branch. Sometime later, when he was 73, he won the lottery, taking home about $800,000. He'd already retired from his job as a music professor, so he bought a boat and lived pretty darn well. He gave a fair chunk of his winnings away, too. As for his luck, he once said, "I'm going to enjoy my life now. I feel like I've been reborn. God has been watching over me all these years. The devil has moved on to torment someone else." Some media have questioned his stories, but those that know him say he told the truth. He once said this about his buddies: "There came a stage when I was lucky to have any friends at all. Many stopped seeing me, saying I was bad karma." He died in 2016, aged 86, but we can't find the cause of death. As we said, what's interesting here is how rare some of his accidents were, so let's talk about the freakiest one. Number 14. We guess you'd all seen those movies when a window or a door breaks on a plane and people get sucked out, their bodies sometimes being broken up as they're forced through such a small place. But that's the movies. Surely, no one gets sucked out of airplanes. The odds of dying in a plane crash are low. and nothing close to the odds of dying in a motor vehicle accident in the US, which according to the National Safety Council is 1 in 102. The same study said dying in a train crash is 1 in 178,741. The odds for dying on a commercial aircraft because of a crash or some other kind of plane malfunction is 1 in 29.4 million. That's rare, but getting sucked out of a window or a door while everyone around you is screaming like mad is even rarer, especially when you're the only one to go. It's happened, but it really is unusual, since there are 3 layers in the window, and even if you wanted to break it, you'd have to do a fair bit of banging with a hammer. So yes, very, very rare. But it's what happened in 2018 to a retired nurse named Jennifer Reardon. She was traveling on a Southwest Airlines flight when a bit of the engine broke and smashed into the window next to where she was sitting. She was almost immediately stuck to the hole and looking like she was about to go through. Other passengers, described as heroic, tried to pull her to safety, but the force of it killed her. She didn't leave the plane, but she was half in, half out. This is not a frequent danger, one expert later said. A lot of research work was done in the 40s and 50s to make sure it wasn't a danger. Double-skinned windows and precautions like that. Mainly, this kind of thing would happen when there's a hole in the fuselage. That happened on a plane going from LA to Sydney in 1989, and 9 folks ended up in the sky. There have also been cases of people going through broken doors, but again, this is about as rare comes. Let's now talk about your favorite thing, poop. Number 13. Can pooping kill? The answer is yes, but you'd be 1 in a few million if it happened to you. We don't mean just dying on the throne from some other thing such as a heart attack, but when pooping is the reason for the death. It can happen after something called defecation syncope, which in layman's terms literally means pooping fainting. It's so rare that the US National Institutes of Health says it is infrequently described in the literature. That paper explained that some people bear down to increase the pressure in the rectum. Hence, you've all tried to squeeze one out, as the saying goes. The paper added, the increase in the pressure of the rectum calls for closure of the epiglottis, tightening of the diaphragm, tightening the muscles of the chest wall, and stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system. This can cause a rapid drop in blood pressure and less blood getting to the brain, and before you have time to think, in some people at least, it's lights out. The paper talked about a 55-year-old widow in the US that had for ages been struggling with constipation, and as some of you will know, squeezing them out in such situations can take quite a lot of effort. This woman was in the hospital for the condition and at one point wanted to poo. She called for a bedpan and pushed as she'd never pushed before, although the paper stated a huge mass was expelled through the vagina instead. She went into shock and almost died, but she pulled through in the end. Still, there have been cases of dying from this, and usually when they were already suffering from other health conditions. Right, if you can die pooping, you can die laughing. Number 12. Laughing yourself to death is a bit like pooping yourself to death in that they both trigger some reactions in the body rather than killing you right out. While death by laughter is said to be extremely rare, there have been documented cases going back to ancient times. Laughing, especially when really hard, can cause a brain aneurysm to rupture. It might also lead to asphyxiation or suffocation, according to the experts. In other circumstances, the person might not find anything funny at all but laugh because of a brain problem. That can lead to seizure and death. Then there's that word syncope again, which in some cases means the person laughs until they faint, and that might cause sudden cardiac death. Let's look at some fairly recent cases. In 1975 in England, a guy named Alex Mitchell was watching an episode of a comedy sketch show called The Goodies. In one particular scene, a Scottish guy in traditional clothes, armed with some bagpipes, has a kung fu fight with a Northern English man armed with nothing but black pudding, aka blood sausage. He laughed for 25 minutes straight, then collapsed in the chair and died. It's thought he might have had a heart condition, and the laughter caused cardiac arrest. In 1989, a Danish audiologist named Ole Benson, who'd been working on the movie A Fish Called Wanda, found it so funny when he watched the first screening that he literally died from laughter, although again it was the laughter that caused him to have heart problems. Writer John Cleese actually thought he should market the film with this incident, but then he said it was probably not in good taste. But our favorite story comes from the 3rd century BC and involved a Greek philosopher named Chrysippus. This guy was famous for trying to understand the meaning of life and the very universe by applying logic to matters, but it seemed he was also a bit of a comedian. One day he was out in his garden with his slave when the slave suddenly shouted to him, "Master, master, a donkey's eating the figs." Chrysippus then surprised the slave by saying, "Okay, go give him some wine to wash it down." He apparently thought his own joke was very funny and he died from laughing. Now for a certain kind of death that we imagine might have only happened once, and let this be a lesson to all of you. Number 11. Some of you went through school at times seeing an idiot going up behind someone and pulling the person's underwear up as high as it can go. That can be painful and leave the person looking a bit silly. As you know, the act is called a wedgie. In 2013, someone died from this. The killer was a guy from Oklahoma named Bradley Davis. He'd been having a fight with his stepfather, and at one point during a tussle, he grabbed his underwear, pulled it really high up, so far it went over his neck, and that cut off his air supply and he died, with the press later calling the act an atomic wedgie. That just means the underwear goes over the head. Davis pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, later saying, "Man, I did a horrible thing when I gave him that wedgie." We can't find any other death from wedgie stories, but we did find a case in which a woman wore such tight shorts on a date that the wedgie caused sepsis, which almost ended her life. This next one is just plain sad. Number 10. The last thing you want is to go to bed and wake up with your partner dead at your side, something that you don't expect if you're young and healthy. This happened in the UK in 2011 when a man, a rather large man, slept next to his lover, a rather small woman. He woke up and she wasn't breathing, with an investigation proving that at some point during the night, he'd moved in his sleep and suffocated her. It was called a freak accident and he wasn't charged. Again, this is unbelievably rare, but what's less rare is dying while having sex. Number 9. We found a few stories of people dying on the job, but they mostly included people exerting themselves when they had heart conditions and then they had a heart attack. In one such case, a British man had traveled to Thailand, and after one night prowling around the red light district of Pattaya, aka Sin City, he met a young woman for a so-called good time. He apparently had taken Viagra, and in the end it was all too much. The police said he died from a heart attack. He was vastly overweight, had been drinking every night, and had underlying health problems, so his night in the sack proved deadly. Don't let this scare you away from sex. Sex and even earth-shaking orgasms are not dangerous, but according to the Journal of American Medical Association, in very rare cases, sex can lead to cardiac events and in some cases, a type of bleeding on the brain called a subarachnoid hemorrhage. What's weird is the Journal of Sexual Medicine said in a study that a fatal cardiac event is more likely to occur in men when they're cheating, and that's what happened to a former vice president of the USA named Nelson Rockefeller. This 70-year-old man died in his townhouse in New York City. The only other person there with him was his 25-year-old former aide, Megan Marshak. It was a bit of a scandal, but not so much because he was infamous for his extramarital affairs. No one has ever proved he died while making love, but people familiar with the matter said he and Marshak were an item, and he died undeniably in intimate circumstances. As we said, it's not so rare. Although when a lion killed a Zimbabwean woman named Shirahi Mawera, she was with her man out in the wilderness in 2013. That was rare. As for the man, a report read, unfortunately, the woman was mauled to death by the lion, but her boyfriend managed to escape, naked. The two were romping when the incident occurred. The lion came from behind and roared. We're afraid that we can't give you any statistics here because as far as we know, there haven't been any studies relating to deaths caused by wild animals during the act of fornication. Sorry about that. We might write a letter of complaint to Johns Hopkins. Then there was the deaths of Brent Tyler and Chelsea Tumbleston when they fell from a building while having sex in South Carolina in 2007. Believe it or not, we found a bunch of stories of people plunging from balconies, roofs, and walls after getting it on. Safe sex is obviously a manifold term. Maybe death from sex in high places isn't that weird after all, but this next kind of death is. Number 8. This disease we're going to talk about now is so rare that only around 400 people in the world have it right now. Its name is Hutchinson-Gilford Progeria Syndrome, HGPS, a disease that makes a young person look very old. It doesn't only accelerate the aging process and how people look, but it makes them suffer from old age-related diseases. That means a kid or a young adult will suffer from things such as joint pain and worse, cardiovascular disease. These folks have an average lifespan of just 14 years. In short, this genetic disease makes cells die prematurely. However, it doesn't affect a person's motor skills and their intellectual development remains normal, as can be seen with the YouTube star Adalia Rose. Besides the way she looked and high-pitched voice, she sounded intellectually just like anyone else her age would. Unfortunately, the disease took her at the age of 15, with her family saying she died peacefully. Now back to accidents, and one case we expect will never happen again. Number 7. As you may know, when it comes to accidental deaths, drowning is one of the most common ways to go. The CDC writes that about 4,000 people in the US die each year from drowning, while the WHO says the global tally is around 235,000. So drowning, not rare at all. But drowning in a beer flood, we can say with confidence, definitely is. It happened in London in the year 1814. On October 17th, a massive vat at a brewery burst open that led to several large barrels of the ale also bursting. The outcome was between 128,000 and 323,000 imperial gallons gushing into a nearby slum. The people had nowhere to run when a 15-foot tsunami of dark porter beer smashed down on the walls of their ugly abodes. One of the victims was a teenage girl, 5 others were Irish immigrants who'd been attending the wake of a 2-year-old boy. This was a tragedy. But the English newspapers didn't think it was anything worth writing about, seeing as only poor folks died. Some folks did write about it though, with some of them saying after the flood almost every adult and child ran around with buckets trying to get all the free beer they could. As for paying a fine or some compensation, it didn't happen. The Irish Times wrote that the government actually bailed the company out after losing so much of its addictive product. Let's now talk about another kind of drowning, although one associated with people trying to get healthy. Number 6. Carrot juice. Who would think such a harmless thing could be deadly? On February 17, 1974, the New York Times ran the headline, "Carrot juice addiction cited in Britain's death." The addict was the 48-year-old Basil Brown, who it was said was on gallons of carrot juice a day before his skin turned bright yellow and he keeled over. Dr. David Haler, the pathologist, said so much vitamin A was too much for the guy, and the cause of death was liver failure. Apparently, on the day he died, he drank 10 gallons of the stuff. This is the only carrot juice overdose death we could find, but this next kind of overdose could happen to you. Number 5. Death by drinking too much water is super rare, but it does happen from time to time. It's called water intoxication. This can lead to hyponatremia, which means the sodium levels in a person's body are too low. It can also cause water on the brain or cerebral edema, and that doesn't just hurt like hell but can finish a person off. It happens more often with athletes who drank loads of water after an event or training, but we found 3 cases where it happened to soldiers who'd been through some tough training. The report said the men had drank over 5 liters of water in a few hours. One of our staff writers here at the show even had a guy die during his military training from this rare condition. It's hard to say how much is too much, but medical professionals tell us that the kidneys might be overwhelmed if a person drinks 3 or 4 liters of water in a short period of time. They don't exactly say what amount is dangerous, so for educational purposes, let's look at some real-life cases. One case involved a healthy 22-year-old guy in the US, while in a detention facility, guzzled 6 liters of water in about 3 hours, which was apparently part of a game he'd been playing. A research paper said he showed progressive psychiatric and neurological signs, including restlessness, peculiar behavior, and convulsions. On his admission, 15 hours after the discontinuation of the water drinking, he was in a coma. Then there was the recent case of a 17-year-old who, after football training at a Georgia high school, drank 2 liters of water and 2 liters of Gatorade very quickly. He collapsed and later died. In 2007, there was a famous case when a woman in California went on a radio show to try and win a Nintendo Wii gaming console. This 28-year-old woman, along with 18 others, was told to drink as much water as possible without going to the bathroom. A nurse was listening to the show at the time, and she called in and warned, "I want to say that these people drinking all that water can get sick and die from water intoxication." The woman actually won, but then she could be heard saying to the DJ, "My head hurts. They keep telling me that it's the water, that it will tell my head to hurt, it'll make me puke." In the competition called Hold Your Wii for a Wii, they had to drink an 8-ounce bottle of water, wait a bit, then drink another. Some people backed out at 8 bottles, but this woman kept going. It's estimated she drank around 2 gallons. The mother of 3 got in the car and complained of a horrific headache. 5 hours later, she was found dead on her bed by her partner. The most recent case we can find was in 2020, also in the US. It involved parents telling their 11-year-old to drink around 3 liters of water in 4 hours. He threw up, but they kept telling him to drink more. They were charged with first-degree murder and some other charges relating to their utterly terrible parenting, although the murder charge was later dropped for the mother. Again, we don't have statistics for this death by water intoxication, but it is very rare. Now let's return to the super weird. Number 4. One way no one wants to go is what we might call an ironic death. Unfortunately, such deaths can be tragic and funny at the same time. One such ironic death would be to die at someone else's funeral, kind of a 2-for-1 deal. We found plenty of cases when someone had a heart attack at a funeral, and some more cases when a car crashed in the funeral procession, but the most messed up cases involve someone being killed by a coffin. The first of which was in London in 1872, when a man named Henry Taylor tripped on a stone while doing his duty as a pallbearer. At that point, with the coffin being too heavy for the others, they all dropped it and it fell on him. The Police News-Gazette wrote at the time, "The greatest confusion was created amongst the mourners who witnessed the accident, and the widow of the person about to be buried nearly went into hysterics." A second case happened in 2018 in Indonesia. A 40-year-old man lost his footing while carrying the heavy coffin up a ladder that led to a ceremonial tower. The coffin landed on him and crushed him, but guess who was inside the coffin? His mother. Talk about tragedy. Now let's ask a question. What do you get when you cross a rather large clouder of crazy cats and 2 helpless women? Number 3. There are a few stories that relate to cats being involved in people's deaths, such as the one when a cat smothered a kid, or another when a feline caused a fatal bicycle collision. There have been cases of cats giving people rabies and other dark tales of people dying from the so-called cat scratching disease, aka Bartonella henselae. But unlike their avowed enemies, dogs, cats don't kill people in a moment of extreme violence. But a cat mauling may have taken place in Iran in the 1800s. How true it is, we don't know, but the usually trustworthy BBC wrote a story about it. It was reported first in Victorian times by the Illustrated Police News. As the story goes, a wealthy and eccentric Iranian lady lived in a rather nice house surrounded by her servants and her cats. Many cats, because she was something of a fan of felines. But one day, a huge fire broke out in the house, which left the cats in a compromising situation. The woman told 2 of her maids to go to the room where the cats were kept, which was dangerous since the house was now almost entirely engulfed by flames. This is what the BBC said happened next. The blaze had driven the beasts berserk. The instant the door was opened, they flew at the unfortunate young woman, tearing, scratching, and biting them in a frenzy. Both women died from their injuries, although we do wonder about the reliability of Victorian-era police news reports. Okay, now you have to ask yourself what a drunk animal could do to a person. Number 2. Good old alcohol. That legal high that has more blood on its hands than 1,000 tyrants put together. If the booze itself doesn't kill you, when mixed with cars and fists and guns and sometimes just the ground itself, alcohol is one dangerous beast. But the best booze death story we could find involved a bear. Bears can be a bit irascible at the best of times, and that might lead to a handful of deaths around the world each year. But can you imagine what a bear would do if he was out of his mind on hooch? We know the answer, because of a story that happened in 1891 in the Russian city of Vilnius, not that one in Lithuania. An unnamed rich man had been given the bear as a pet, and while it had been trained, a bear is still a bear. It was said that the man's servants liked to play with the bear, and one thing they enjoyed above everything else was getting it drunk on vodka. We don't know how this happened, but one day the bear had gotten out of the guy's house and ended up at the local tavern. Seems fitting enough. There it somehow managed to sniff out a keg of vodka, and it proceeded to drink it in vast quantities. The innkeeper, named Isaac Rabanovich, was less than pleased, and so he attempted to take the keg away from the bear. But now, with the animal half-baked, it did what humans often do when drunk and went on the attack. Rabanovich was killed, and the bear wasn't done. It also killed his 2 sons and a daughter. When the villagers arrived at the tavern, the bear was fast asleep on the floor next to a pool of blood and vodka. If it could have spoken, no doubt it would have said, "Guys, I have no idea how this happened." They shot it on the spot. This is the only death by a drunken animal story we could find, so we're going to call this kind of thing very rare. Okay, last one, and a story that is like nothing else we've ever heard. Number 1. Zombie talk isn't anything new. In fact, some people from the past actually believed in zombies rather than, as we do, just tell stories about them. For instance, if you were to look at a particular paper published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, you would come across a story of villagers in medieval Yorkshire, England, chopping up dead people so they wouldn't rise from the grave. You can actually find cases going back thousands of years where people all over the world buried their dead by weighing or tying them down. So when we tell you this next story, just bear in mind that folks in the old days might have taken the living dead very seriously. It happened in Russia during the 19th century. According to the BBC, a funeral was in full flow when the coffin opened and a man opened the door and got out. The article explained, this was, needless to say, an unexpected turn of events. White-faced with fear, the priest and the mourners alike ran from the church of their Russian village and scattered to their homes, bolting their doors. The zombie apparently then went after them, walking out of the church and heading to the house of an elderly lady. Meanwhile, a quite rational priest had come to the conclusion that this guy had been in a coma and come out of it, and now just needed some help. The priest went to tell the local peasants, but by this time they'd already armed themselves and gone zombie hunting. By the time the priest caught up with him, the zombie had been cut to pieces and subsequently thrown into a marsh. People have been signed off as dead and come back many times in history, even recently. But back in those days, in places where science wasn't exactly embraced, that kind of thing could be deadly. We'd say being killed because you're accused of being a zombie was a one-off, but in 2015, a Walking Dead fan murdered his buddy in New Mexico with a knife, an electric guitar, and a microwave because he believed he was a zombie. The killer, a father of 2, had no history of mental illness, although alcohol had been enthusiastically consumed before the attack. We don't think we can beat that, so we'll just end the show here. It's time to crack open the torture chamber once again and look at 10 more of the worst punishments ever designed to be worse than death. And we'll start with one that wasn't designed to kill at all, at least not for a while. Number 10. Branding. There are few greater tools in criminal justice than shame. A clever judge or two might have sentenced a drunk driver to stand on a street corner with a sign professing his crime, and who could forget Cersei Lannister being marched around in her infamous shame parade? But what if someone wanted the shame to go on forever? What if a particularly sadistic judge or ruler wanted to make sure that wherever the convicted went, people would know they were a traitor, a thief, or a heretic, and treat them accordingly? That's where a common farm tool comes in handy. Branding has a simple use in most farms to ensure everyone knows who cattle belongs to if it gets loose. A few seconds with a hot iron, some loud mooing, and the farmer's property is secure. But it wasn't limited to that. During the time of slavery, sadistic owners would do the same thing for the same reason, to make sure everyone knew their slave was their property, and in the past, criminals would be given a brand to make sure everyone knew their guilt, and often the specifics of the crime. In the 16th century, those deemed heretics against the Catholic Church were branded with a cross, and in the New World, the torture got more specific. Branding was commonly used in early North American colonies to mark those deemed trouble, and you would literally get a scarlet letter. People convicted of adultery got the letter A, burglars and blasphemers got B, which might lead to some explanation, and those guilty of public drunkenness got the letter D, which seemed rather harsh for a night of partying. With no way to hide the scar, for the rest of your life you'd be marked as a criminal and treated accordingly, which could mean being excluded from polite society, or in some cases it might mean being sought out for a wild night. It's not the only torture you were supposed to survive, and in Europe, they got creative. Number 9. The Spanish Boot. During the Middle Ages, torture was disturbingly common as a way to extract information, but many of the tortures stood the risk of ending the interrogation way too early and sending the truth to the grave with the victim. So how do you keep a victim alive long enough to break them down for information? You torture an area of the body the person can live without, but would really like to keep. A popular choice? The legs, which can take a lot of punishment for a long time, and so some particularly sadistic Spanish torture designers came up with a shoe that's never in fashion. Even the most daring fashionista will want to avoid wearing the Spanish boot. But the Spanish didn't come up with the first prototype. That honor went to the Scots, who designed it out of rawhide. You soak the garment, wrap it around the victim's foot, and then heat it over a fire, causing the rawhide to drastically contract and crush the victim's foot, causing dislocated bones. This was good for inducing pain, but not causing serious damage. The British improved the model with wooden boards, but the Spanish designed a version out of iron, with the ability not just to hurt the victim, but to crush their feet beyond repair. And it turned out that it was a very effective way to get information. First, the victim's lower leg and foot was strapped into the iron boot, then wedges were placed in between the casing and the flesh, and hammered in brutally. With each wedge between the hard iron and the soft flesh, more damage was done to the victim's leg, and they'd become very willing to tell the interrogators whatever they wanted to know. Of course, the torture wasn't necessarily over then either. Torturers would like to force the victims to walk in the boots or pour hot liquid into the casing to increase the pain. The torture was survivable, but in the days it was most commonly used, those who suffered it for an extended period would often die of infection or be permanently disabled from the crushed bones. This next one was probably one of the rarest execution methods of all time. Fortunately. Number 8. The Brazen Bull. The time was ancient Greece, and the city of Acragas in what's now Sicily was ruled by a man named Rarest, a tyrant known for his love of creative execution methods and showing off his power. He wanted a new star attraction. One of his subjects, Painless, took up the task and produced a truly sadistic final act for the unfortunate victim, in the form of a giant metal bull. But this was no ordinary statue. The bronze figurine would serve as a cage, with a door in one side, and the condemned would be locked inside. Then a fire would be lit, and they would be burned alive for the whole court to watch. But this wasn't just a standard burning. Legend says that the bull had an acoustic device inside that would make the scream sound like a bull's cry. It lived up to the demands of the tyrant, but be careful what you wish for. The tyrant Rarest was impressed, so impressed in fact that he wanted to see it demonstrated right away. But rather than find a petty criminal to execute like he normally did, Rarest ordered Painless placed inside himself and lit the fire. Sure enough, Painless began screaming, and Rarest was satisfied that the system worked, and he had his new favorite designer taken out, still alive, and given a great reward. Wait, no, that would make sense. Instead, he had the guy who just built him his new favorite device thrown off the top of a hill to his death. Not the best retirement plan. and the bull got quite a workout over his reign. Rarest was big on showmanship, and the device delivered. According to reports of the time, it spewed out impressive plumes of smoke as the condemned burned, and the bones that were left were reportedly made into jewelry by the Mad King, like a normal person would do. It became his favorite form of entertainment until he was overthrown and became the bull's final resident. No prototype of the bull has ever been found, leading some historians to believe it to be a propaganda tale made up by his enemies, but the accounts are so descriptive and graphic that others say it's entirely believable for a Mad King to create such a torture. It was fast and brutal, but to the east, some torturers preferred it slow. Number 7. Ling Chi. A knife is one of the most common methods to execute someone, and it can be as simple as a fast cut to the throat. Brutal and efficient, but efficient was not what the executioners in China around 1,000 years ago had in mind. For those guilty of especially heinous crimes, such as treason, a punishment known as the death of 1,000 cuts awaited them, and it wasn't an exaggeration. For those punished in this way, the goal was to keep them alive indefinitely in agonizing pain as the torturer removed parts of them with a knife. And this punishment had another horrible element to it, because it wasn't just a punishment for the body, it was a punishment for the soul. According to Confucian principles, cutting the body or altering it was a sin against the principles of respect for one's parents. After all, they gave you that body, so by altering the body in this manner, the executioners would keep the condemned from being whole in the afterlife. And this was usually a public affair. The condemned would be tied to a wooden frame in public, and the executioner would go to work. They would cut away the flesh from the body, usually from non-critical areas like the legs first, and the victim would be left to linger, often with onlookers jeering and throwing things at them, and often the victim would be left begging for death. So what brought an end to this torture? How long it went on depended on how bad the crime was and how sadistic the executioner was. Some would rather quickly take pity on the convict and cut their throat after only a day of torture, while others could keep their victims alive for weeks. And as usual, hello, Madame Guillotine, an execution weapon invented for the worst of the worst, soon spiraled out of control. It was intended for treason, but soon emperors started using it against anyone they wanted to make an example of. Soon, even the family members of their political enemies could be subjugated to the torture. People started getting horrified, and eventually the practice was outlawed, but not before it became one of the most iconic and disturbing visuals out of Imperial China. It wasn't the only horrible punishment that took it slow. Number 6. Death by boiling. Ah, soup. Is there anything that smells better than a meat broth bubbling away on the stove? What's cooking? Oh my god. That's right, back in the Middle Ages, they were making human soup regularly. Not for consumption, but for punishment. It all started back in England, which introduced the penalty of death by boiling as punishment for murder by poisoning. Why such a cruel punishment for one specific method of murder? Because that was the preferred method of assassinating kings at the time. And King Henry VIII wanted to make sure no one got any ideas. And naturally, once someone got the bright idea for a new torture method, it started spreading. And that meant horrible things for anyone convicted. It was one of the simplest execution methods around. All you needed was a large cauldron and a bunch of rope to keep the condemned from getting free. Oh, and a liquid. Water was the most common, but oil, tar, or tallow burned hotter and faster and created a more dramatic show. The restrained convict would be placed into the cauldron, the liquid would be poured in, and the flame underneath it would be lit as the water slowly started boiling. And this could take a while, and the convict would not die immediately. Remember what they say about frogs in boiling pots? If the bath was water, it would just start like a sauna. If it was a stickier substance, it would get a lot more unpleasant a lot faster. But one way or another, eventually the liquid would get so hot that it would start burning the skin of the condemned, putting them in agonizing pain. Breathing in the boiling steam would start to scald their lungs, and the body would dehydrate quickly. What would eventually kill them? Probably the shock from the damage done to their body, which would make them pass out and drown in the horrible stew. One way or another, it was a gruesome show that likely put spectators off a soup for a while, we hope. This one horrible punishment lasted the test of time, but wound up with a nightmarish legacy. Number 5. The gas chamber. How to execute people has always been a tricky question. Beheading? So messy. Hanging? There's always a chance of failure. Firing squad? You need to get people with good aim. And as technology marched on, some people thought, couldn't we find a cleaner and foolproof way to do this nasty deed? It started in 1803 when an infamous French military commander executed large groups of Haitian prisoners of war by filling the cargo holds when they were being held with sulfur dioxide, poisoning and suffocating them within minutes. The use of poison gas as an execution method had been invented, and it would only grow from there. But is it truly an easier execution method? Not for the condemned. While it's cleaner and has the highest rate of success of any execution method, for the person in the chamber it's horrible. In single-person executions, the condemned is strapped down to a chair in the room as poison gas, usually hydrogen cyanide, is pumped into the room. The condemned can see the gas as it's piped in and is usually told to breathe in as quickly as possible because they'll fall unconscious faster. If they don't, they're likely to have seizures and lose bodily function as the gas wreaks havoc on their body, and it can take several minutes before they finally die. The convulsions can be severe, with one murderer beating his head so hard against a metal bar that it broke the chair. So, why isn't this system used more? The gas chamber has mostly fallen out of favor as an execution method due to how expensive it is, as well as the risk of toxic gas leaking and poisoning the people around the chamber. It's been replaced by another poison method, the lethal injection, which is usually faster and less painful. But the main reason few people want to see the gas chamber make a comeback is because of its association with Nazi Germany, where the tyrants used it to create a mass execution chamber targeting Jews, Roma, and others deemed inferior or enemies of the Nazi regime. Much like the guillotine, once an execution method is used in mass murder, most people overseeing executions would rather stay away from it. Now let's head to the high seas, because who's better at coming up with evil punishments than pirates? Number 4. Marooning. Sometimes the worst thing you can do to someone is leave them to their own devices. Say a pirate's been breaking the rules at sea. Maybe he was caught skimming the top off the treasure, or he had a little too much grog and punched the captain. Arr, he's in for a bad time. After locking him in the brig, the captain eventually takes him out as the ship hits land, leads him off the ship to a desert island, and leaves him there to fend for himself. He's just been marooned, and this punishment often amounted to an extended and painful death sentence depending on where he's been stranded. And more thought was often put into this than expected. The island was little more than a slip of land bobbing in the water with nowhere to get shade, nowhere to get food, and no fresh water in sight. The sun beat down endlessly. The water would just make you more thirsty, and there's little hope of rescue. The captain would often give the mutinous pirate some items, a water jug, some food, and a loaded pistol. What that pistol would be used for was entirely up to the pirate. The situation wasn't entirely hopeless. Another ship could come by, but in most cases the marooned pirate would only last days at most. Of course, this was not always the case. Sometimes the pirates would drop the exiled sailor onto a larger island, one with shelter, inland springs, and coconuts and animals. This often came down to the luck of the draw, whichever island the ship came upon first. In this case, a determined marooned pirate could carve out a hard but sustainable life for themselves, hunting, foraging, and building themselves a shelter. Some could last years there until another ship came upon the island, maybe searching for treasure or goods, or maybe dropping off their own mutineer. And if any other ship picked up that survivor, they would likely have a very determined new recruit with a specific pirate captain he would love to declare war on, which is why many pirate captains did not take that chance. Number 3. Walking the plank. It's probably the most iconic image in media of pirates. Someone crossed the captain, maybe a mutineer or a pirate who failed his mission. Maybe the pirates captured a notorious enemy of theirs. One way or another, it's time to walk the plank. As execution methods go, this one's simple as it comes. The condemned is bound and forced to walk on a wooden plank outside the ship. Why would anyone actually take this walk? Because on the other side, the captain's usually brandishing a sword. There's nowhere to go except take that long walk off a short plank and into the water below. So, should all pirates just learn to swim? Well, it's not that simple, and walking the plank was usually a much more direct form of execution than marooning. For one thing, the captive's arms are bound to keep them from fighting back, and also to keep them from swimming. If they do manage to get their arms loose and not drown immediately, they're still in turbulent ocean water, quite possibly surrounded by sharks and other predatory animals, and there's still the risk of the ship getting moving and running right over them. If all this goes right and the plank walker survives, they're still stranded in the middle of the ocean, bobbing on the waves with no food or fresh water around. So, how often did this actually happen? If you look at the media, you probably think pirates made people walk the plank on a daily basis. It did happen in real life, but it seems to be reserved for extreme situations. The first event was actually a group of mutineers forcing their officers to walk the plank in the 1760s, and slave ships often did it to their captives. It seemed to be the habit of particularly sadistic pirates, but the visual caught on. In reality, pirates would definitely be hesitant to do it for minor offenses. After all, when running a large ship on a long-range course, every crew member matters, and even captives can be put to work. There's always the threat of the plank to keep them in line. But it may not be the most sadistic seafaring punishment. Number 2. Keel hauling. It was maybe the cruelest fate dealt out by sea captains, and surprisingly, it wasn't the pirates who were doing it. Dating back to the time of ancient Greece, it was dealt out by the reputable sea captains. Mutineers, thieves, and pirates were subject to this punishment, which began by tying a line to the sailor's waist. The line was looped below the vessel, and the sailor was then taken and thrown overboard. The sailor would then be dragged below the ship's keel with the massive vessel bearing down on them and pushing them under the water. But this was so much more than just the world's worst case of waterboarding. While not technically a death sentence, there were many ways it could go badly for the sailor. For one thing, if the ship was moving too slowly, it would drown them before they arrived at the other side and were picked out of the water. Moving their head the wrong way at the wrong time could result in the ship's hull crushing their head and killing them instantly. But the worst part was what lurked under the ship's hull. Barnacles, the small sea creatures attached to the bottom of the ship over the years, giving it a jagged texture. This would often cut the back of the unfortunate sailor to shreds, not only causing agonizing pain, but exposing them to a potentially fatal infection. And while it isn't the most famous punishment of the seas, it might be the harshest. The most famous example of this punishment probably came in Mutiny on the Bounty, where the infamous Captain Blight keel-hauls a sailor and causes him to die, which later leads to him being overthrown. However, this was a fictional creation. The only crew members to die on Blight's ship died of natural causes. However, there is ample evidence to suggest that this was a common punishment in the Dutch Navy. Most reports are that it wasn't intended to be a fatal punishment and was considered equivalent to flogging, which indicates that the captains may have overestimated just how hardy the average sailor was. But nothing topped this evil punishment, and it's back to medieval England. Number 1. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. No surprise, there's no greater crime in most societies than high treason, probably because it threatens the safety of those in power, and they have the power to pass laws giving those who consider it something to fear. And in the year 1352, the current monarch passed a law creating a new punishment for those betraying him. One that wasn't just an execution, it was a spectacle designed to destroy the culprit in full view of the entire community, with each part of their execution being worse than the last. Those sentenced to being hung, drawn, and quartered might just beg for death. First, the convicted traitor is tied to a wooden board, which is then tied to the back of a horse. The horse is then ridden through town, dragging the condemned to their final execution place, often as jeering onlookers throw things at them along the route. They're then taken to the gallows and hung, but not in such a way that'll break their neck. They're nearly strangled to the point of death, and then cut down. And that's when the torment truly begins. First, they're castrated, then they're disemboweled, beheaded, and their body is cut into 4 parts. At some point along the way, they die. But don't let that stop the execution party. This used to be reserved for the worst of the worst, but that wasn't always the case. Another variant for this sadistic punishment was simply quartering, and all you needed was a rope and 4 horses. The condemned would have their limbs tied to the 4 horses, with each one attached to a different horse. The horses would then be spooked, often by firing a gun or a firework into the air, and the horses would bolt. As they did, the horses would suddenly and brutally pull the limbs off the condemned, often ripping them clean off. Rather than a formal execution for treason, this was often an informal punishment for horse thieves, not approved of by the legal authorities, if there were any, but they certainly weren't going to interfere. It kinda puts picking up trash for community service duty into perspective. It's April 6, 1994, and 2 men plunge into the water. Their goal? To break the world diving record. But only one of them will ever return. They're going to the most extreme depths possible for a human, over 500 feet below the surface, a place where anything can go wrong in an instant, where it doesn't matter how much you practiced, how much you planned, or even if you're a world-class athlete, you can still fall victim to the most brutal, yet silent death in history. The Zacaton sinkhole, located in Tamaulipas, Mexico, with a depth of over 1,000 feet. It's one of the deepest water-filled sinkholes in the world. This depth had made it somewhat of an aquatic Mount Everest for many ambitious divers over the years, including renowned divers Jim Bowden and Shek Exley, who was the first person in the world to log over 100 cave dives. At age 19, Exley and his younger brother competed to see how deep they could dive in the Wakala Springs, pushing the needle on a pressure gauge as far as it would go. Shek's brother dove to 50 feet before he went limp and began floating down. He was pulled from the water and rushed to a hospital, but unfortunately did not survive. A fate that is sadly all too common in extreme deep diving. His brother's death didn't cause him to stop, though. Instead, it drove Exley to go deeper and deeper, chasing ever more extreme depths. To put it into perspective, your average diver is advised not to go deeper than 130 feet, or 300 feet for the highly trained and skilled. Exley, though, set his sights much higher, or rather lower. He planned to reach the very bottom of the Zacaton sinkhole, all 1,112 feet of it.
A few years prior to his dive at Zacaton, Exley had shattered depth records by diving to 780 feet in the Mexican cave of Nacimiento Monte. This is also where he first met Jim Bowden, and the two became fast friends over their love of exploration. The two men had both been to Zacaton before. There was no strong current to be found and the area was easy to access, and in April 1993, Exley reached 721 feet, while Bowden reached 504. While Bowden and Exley realized the potential for Zacaton, it was as if they'd uncovered the most incredible treasure. This was, in their view, the perfect spot to smash a record and pass an unheard-of milestone, diving down 1,000 feet. To understand just how deep that dive is, diving to 1,000 feet is like descending the length of more than 3 football fields placed end to end. It would be an incredible feat, and the men vowed to complete their dive within the year. A year that, for one of those ambitious divers, would turn out to be their last. A year goes by quickly, too, and April 1994 soon arrived, which meant it was time for the men to see their dream fulfilled. The two divers meticulously prepared for their dive, which included their mixes of gas for the journey. When diving, the mixture of gas placed in one's tanks is crucial for survival. For recreational diving down to 130 feet, it's standard practice to use air similar to what we breathe on the surface, with 79% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. For dives beyond 130 feet, divers will use something called a trimix, a mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium. Common mixtures include 2135 or 21% oxygen, 35% helium, and 44% nitrogen, or 1845, which is 18% oxygen and 45% helium. For dives deeper than 197 feet, the amount of helium needs to be increased to reduce the risk of oxygen toxicity. This is known as a hypoxic mixture, and a standard mix for a depth of more than 300 feet is 10% oxygen, 70% helium, and 20% nitrogen. Even with a perfectly measured gas mixture in all of their tanks, the divers would need to breathe carefully in order to manage the amount of gas in their tanks and avoid running out as the pressure increased. And even the smallest change in the rate of one's breathing could throw off their calculations with deadly consequences. But they had trained rigorously for this undertaking, and now it was time to put their expertise to the test. Exley, Bowden, and their support team of Mary Ellen Eckhoff, Karen Hola, Anna Kristovich, and Marcos Gary gathered near the sinkhole. They were joined by members of the press, including a writer and a photographer from Sports Illustrated, a photographer from Destination Discovery, and a TV crew from Channel 7 News of Tampico. Even the owner of the land and his family had come to see the amazing feat achieved. Everyone watched as Bowden and Exley strapped on their gear and began to swim. They first passed from El Pasaje de Tortuga Muerta, a 600-foot passage leading to the dive site. The men surfaced and reached their respective descent lines. There was no turning back now. They would be diving together but independently. They remarked on the beautiful weather they'd been graced with, hopefully an auspicious sign, and they wished each other luck. It was finally time to break the world diving record. Bowden and Exley began to descend. They met each other's eyes, nodding, before entering a free fall down toward the bottom of the sinkhole. Exley had done everything he could to prepare himself for this dive. He'd been going to more and more extreme depths, but while attempting to explore an underwater cave at Bushmanskat in South Africa, he reached a depth of 863 feet before he was suddenly overcome with troubling physical symptoms. He experienced tremors, visual hallucinations such as flashing auras around people and objects, and other hallucinations. All of these were textbook symptoms of high-pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. HPNS can set in at a depth of 500 feet or more, and as divers descend below 600 feet, the risk of HPNS dramatically increases. HPNS is triggered by the speed of compression and pressure during a descent. The exact physical nature of HPNS is still up for debate, but it may be related to the compression of cell membranes in the central nervous system. At the depths that they were diving to, it could potentially be deadly if they weren't careful. Bowden had previously experienced HPNS on his dives as well, and the two men planned to strategically slow their descents in order to prevent falling victim to it again at this crucial moment. But even the best laid plans can go awry. Bowden's strategy for the descent was to fall at a rate of 100 feet per minute up to 300 feet using his air tank, then switching to Heliair, a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen for the next 600 feet
before finally switching to his bottom mix for the final stretch. At around 750 to 800 feet, he would slow down, and that was where he had experienced HPNS symptoms on a previous dive. As planned, he slowed at the 800-foot mark, noticing a small tremor in his body. He could see Exley's light on in the distance. His friend had pressed on ahead of him, but they would see each other again at the bottom. At least that's what he thought. As he reached 900 feet, though, Bowden could no longer think about Exley. He checked his gas gauge and saw that something was terribly wrong. He was shocked to find that it had dipped to nearly 1,000 psi, when he had planned to have at least 1,800 at this point in the dive. If he didn't figure something out, and soon, he wouldn't have enough air to survive the decompression on the way up. He was suddenly in a life-and-death situation. When ascending from a dive, divers must carefully decrease their ambient pressure a bit at a time in order to reacclimate their bodies to the pressure changes, to dissolve any inert gases in their system. Without adequate decompression, nitrogen bubbles can form in the bloodstream, blocking vital blood flow to various parts of the body. Depending on the frequency of stops during the ascent and the depth of a dive, decompression can take up to 24 hours, time that Bowden absolutely did not have. Thinking quickly, he inflated his BCD wings, a buoyancy control device that fills with air, and stopped his descent at 925 feet. Then he switched to the tank of bottom mix under his right arm until switching to his travel mix as he climbed up to 450 feet. He assumed that Exley had continued descending toward the bottom of the sinkhole and that he would see him back at the top later. But Bowden wasn't the only one facing an unexpectedly difficult dive. At about 9 minutes in, when Exley was at a depth of approximately 879 feet below the surface, his vision began to blur and his body began to shake with muscle tremors. At this point, he had limited options. His most obvious course would be attempt an ascent, just as Bowden had when he realized his tanks were running low. But nitrogen narcosis, a daze-induced effect caused by deep diving as more nitrogen is absorbed into the blood, was beginning to set in. Its drug-like symptoms combined with tremors and dizziness made it difficult to think straight or orient himself in the water. In order to stabilize himself, he wrapped his descent line around his arms to hold himself in place and gather his thoughts. The stress of the HPNS symptoms caused him to breathe faster than planned, and he was forced to switch gas tanks. This only made matters worse, and the combination of physical exertion, hyperoxia, along with the nitrogen narcosis and HPNS, all combined with the dizzying effect of CO2 buildup. Joints locked in place, resisting movement, while it became harder and harder to form thoughts. His nervous system, eyes, heart, and lungs were all struggling to do their jobs while being pushed to the absolute limit. He may have tried to manually inflate his BC with compressed gas, but was unable to do so. He was trapped, 879 feet down with no clear way out, grappling with symptoms that included hallucinations, stiff joints, paranoia, and vertigo. And all the while, the air was running out. As Exley was struggling to hold on, Bowden was fighting a battle of his own. When he reached 450 feet, he found that his nightmare scenario had become a reality. Both tanks that he'd used to breathe were empty. The regulator for his gas tanks was failing, and his only option was to open and close the valve entirely and hope he could make it the 8 minutes of ascent between him and the next bottle of air hanging on his line. He ascended, minutes feeling like hours, never knowing if each breath would be his last. But as his arms reached out, he suddenly found that he had made it, and with his hands on a bottle that had a functioning regulator, he could breathe a little bit easier. But he wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. It was now time to navigate the lengthy decompression period, while attempting to prevent oxygen toxicity and a nasty case of the bends. When he reached 130 feet, he was ready to relax a bit, knowing that he was almost in the clear. But at this point, he noticed something that had made his heart sink. He could see Exley's descent line, along with the fact that his bottles had gone unused. But maybe it was all right, he told himself. Maybe Exley had gone deeper than him, broken the record, and was still somewhere below, making his way back up. But while Bowden was unsure about what had happened to Exley, the support team on the surface could tell something was wrong. Karen Hole and Ann Kristovich could see a set of bubbles indicating that one of the divers had begun to ascend back to the surface. There was just one problem. There was only one set of bubbles. Kristovich, the team's medical officer and herself a record-breaking diver, who set the women's record at 554 feet, wrote on an underwater slate, "Where is Shek?" Mary Ellen Eckhoff wasted no time. She grabbed an extra bottle of gas mixture and told the others, "I'm going to 250 to look for bubbles."
She dove all the way to 279 feet, where near Exley's line she saw two small white squares floating in the water. At first she couldn't be sure what they were, then the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. They were laminated pages of Exley's dive profile, which he had used as a planning tool for his descent and ascent. She couldn't see him to confirm for sure, but she knew at that moment Shek Exley was lost down there, somewhere in the dark. Hola met Mary Ellen at about 100 feet. The other woman was on her way back up, and she was clearly distraught. Her eyes were filled with tears, mixing with the fresh water of the sinkhole, and her mask was off kilter. She expressed a desire to go back up to the surface right away to tell everyone what had happened, but it wasn't safe. Her gauge read 278 feet. With no other option, Hola took the other woman in her arms and held her in the silence of the water until 30 minutes had passed. Neither of them could remember a time when they felt so very alone, adrift in the deep with nothing but their grief and each other. Somewhere between 60 and 100 feet, Hola used sign language to tell Bowden what had happened. She couldn't find Shek anywhere. When they were back on the surface, they would have to mount a search for him. Unable to rush his decompression any more than he already had in the face of malfunctioning gas tanks, Bowden went through the motions in a numb, robotic fashion for the rest of the ascent. After nearly 10 hours in the water, Bowden emerged beneath a night sky and suffered his second case of the bends in his career. Kristovich treated him with a combination of intravenous steroids, anticoagulants, and painkillers, and by the next morning he had recovered from the physical wear and tear on his body, but not from the pain of losing Exley somewhere during the dive. He reached a depth of 915 feet, breaking the world record for open-circuit scuba diving, but at a devastating cost. As days passed, the team feared that they would never know what happened, that any answers were buried with Exley's body at the bottom of the sinkhole. But then, 3 days later, as the team began to pull up Exley's line, the unused decompression tanks and the other equipment, his body came with it, tangled up in the guideline. But the story wasn't over yet. There were questions only an examination of Exley's body could answer, tales only he could tell, even in death. His wrist-mounted dive computer read 879 feet. Exley's body was wrapped in the line, twisted around his arms, and the valves of his side-mounted bottles in a manner that seemed deliberate. It was possibly used to stabilize his position in the water, but there was an additional possibility floated by Bowden and the others. Perhaps, in the final moments of lucidity, Exley had wanted to spare his fellow divers the risk of a dangerous body retrieval attempt. Perhaps in those moments, he thought of his brother, whose body he had been unable to recover from the water so many years ago. Whether intentional or not, Exley made certain his colleagues and friends would be able to get him back and lay him to rest. Only Shek Exley knows for certain what happened to him deep in the darkness of the Zakaton sinkhole. The condition of his body provided few clues as to what had happened down in the deep. Though his mask and equipment were in place, he did not have a regulator in his mouth. His BC contained gas and his inflator was functional. The gas mixtures in his tanks had been accurately measured for the depth of the dive. There was nothing unusual found in the autopsy, suggesting that faced with the myriad stressors and symptoms plaguing him at that depth, Exley had simply not been able to get another regulator into his mouth. He had likely convulsed or lost consciousness and simply slipped away nearly 900 feet below the surface. The peers that Exley left behind that day could never know for certain what happened to him. They could only give it their best guess. They knew one thing for certain, though: he would not have panicked. Exley had the coolest head they knew, and nerves of steel that allowed him to save numerous other divers over the years. Whatever happened, he was not afraid. The people of El Nacimiento and Higueron left a cross and flowers at the edge of Zakaton in the days following the loss of Exley, a simple memorial to a man who had treated the area with a deep reverence and respect. Though he was lost, Exley died doing what he loved most: exploring. In the words of Jim Bowden, "I do believe that we both were never more alive than in those moments of trial." He added, "I will miss him very much, but then we always dove alone anyway. Perhaps now he will be with me more than ever." And so we can only hope that in those last moments before he drew his final breath, Shek Exley truly lived. The crowd stood in shocked silence as Gheorghe Doja, the leader of a bloody peasant revolt, was dragged to his place of execution. His deathbed loomed before him, a sadistic piece of apparatus that would test the limits of brutality. A procession of Doja's men followed in his wake. They were about to be forced to commit an act of savagery beyond their comprehension. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we'll look at one of the most cruel deaths in history. This is the gruesome story of Gheorghe Doja and the Hot Iron Crown. Gheorghe Doja was born in 1470 in Transylvania, Romania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary. Later in life, he'd become known as something of a soldier of fortune in a region fraught with rebellions during a time of political tyranny and unjustifiable high taxes on an angry peasantry. Violence came naturally to Doja. As a young man, he committed a robbery at a marketplace, killing a number of merchants. His acumen for violence had gained him a fierce reputation by the time he was hired to fight against the Ottoman forces, for which he was eventually knighted by the King of Hungary and bestowed with property and gold. Following a successful campaign against the Ottomans, Doja became a household name with the Hungarian nobility. He was asked to put an army of crusaders together to fight the Muslim Turks. Slowly but surely, Doja enlisted peasants, yeomen, students, and religious men. He taught them the meaning of discipline. He taught them how to fight. He taught them how to kill. But when the time came for the Crusades to begin, the nobles refused to supply Doja's men with food and clothing. The last straw for the growing gang of 40,000 peasants was the landlords calling them in for harvest. When they refused, the landlords turned their wrath on the peasants' wives and children, who were already living in a state of near starvation. Doja and the peasants soon turned against the landlords, burning down their houses, taking all the riches they could grab. This soon developed into a full-scale peasant rebellion. The bodies of thousands of dead nobles lay strewn across the countryside. Manor houses burned bright in the night skies. Blood stained the walls of the castles the peasants looted. It turned out the peasants were actually very good at killing, partly in thanks to the training led by Gheorghe. The noble class was having nightmares. These rebels didn't just kill you, they often impaled or crucified the nobles, wiping out their families at the same time. To stop the revolution in its tracks, mercenaries were brought in from Venice and Bohemia, but Hungary continued to burn as Doja and his men demanded a redistribution of the land from the nobles to the peasant class, their army moving closer and closer to the capital, Buda. Doja warned the threatenous lying nobility who stood against him, threatening to suspend and hang nobles on their own gates, destroy their property, tear down their houses, and kill their wives and children in the midst of the greatest possible torture. The nobles were already planning a torture for Doja that was so vile it would make impalement seem tame. But for now, his army expanded. He enlisted not just Hungarians, but Romanians, Serbs, Slovaks, and Germans. Word spread across Eastern Europe. Fear spread among the wealthy. The uprising had to be stopped. On July 15th, the peasants run as victors crashed to a bloody end at Timișoara, Romania. An army of 20,000 men hired by the nobles crushed the rebellion. At the time, one of Doja's bands, headed by his brother Gheorghe, was just 2 miles away from their target of Buda. The payback against the rebels would be extreme. A warning had been sent to the peasants of the empire. This is what you get when you try to mess with the established order. They had watched their fellow nobility being bludgeoned, impaled, beheaded, and burned to death. So the nobles set their minds to creating something so sadistic the shock would reverberate all around Europe. The punishment had to have a symbolic element. Doja had pretensions of being a king, so his punishment should be fitting for a king. He wanted the land to be shared among the peasants, so his captors devised a punishment that would mockingly and brutally align with these wishes. Some of the people were still on his side. The rebels who hadn't been captured tried to regroup, but the nobles rounded up the masses of peasants and tortured around 70,000 of them in what became a reign of terror in Hungary. The revolution was well and truly over. The day of Doja's execution went something like this. The crowd jeered and screamed obscenities at a now naked Doja as he was led out by men clutching daggers and swords. An iron throne sat on a platform above smoldering embers. The heat was so intense the throne glowed red. At its side, an iron crown and scepter were also being heated on hot coals. "So, you want to be the king of the peasants," the nobility had told Doja during his torture. "Then we'll make you the king of the peasants." Doja remained silent as he was marched toward the throne. He'd already forgiven those who had testified against him. He understood that their statements had almost certainly been forced out of them, as their feet were burned and their bones were crushed. No words were necessary. He was about to become a martyr. John Zapula, the man who'd led the defeat of the peasant army, lifted his arm in the air, and the crowd quieted. The judges who delivered Doja's sentence looked on, as behind Zapula, 3 rebels were impaled on spikes, their blood dripping down the poles. Someone in the crowd screamed words of support for Doja, who was now seemingly in a deep contemplation. A soldier rushed in and grabbed the man by the arm, dragging him away. The popping embers of the fire filled the stunned silence. "Let the coronation begin," Zapolya cried. Pipes and violins started to play a mocking tune as men dragged Doja over to the heated throne. They pushed him into the seat, where his skin immediately began to burn. He writhed in pain and tried to get away, but the soldiers kept pushing him back down. But no matter how intense the pain became, he didn't speak, just as he'd promised. The crowd grew strangely silent and still as Doja stopped resisting, looking almost calm. But this was only due to the fact that the hot iron had finally destroyed his nerves, providing him with some small amount of relief. At this point, one of the executioners drove a spike into Doja's back. He now just moaned, unable to move or react, his mind completely broken. But the coronation was just beginning. One of Doja's tormentors then used a pair of tongs to carefully pick up the heated crown from the embers of the fire and place it on Doja's head. The burning hot scepter was then also retrieved from the coals and placed in his hands. At this point, Doja was delirious, his life fading away. But before he fell unconscious, he had yet another torture to bear. He was forced to watch as his brother Gerge was brought before him. Doja had been promised his admission of guilt would mean his brother was spared, but all he could do was watch as he was killed right in front of him. It was another betrayal and another humiliation. But the barbarity still wasn't over. It was time for the pièce de résistance. A procession of captured rebels was led to the throne at sword point. They had been promised if they did something truly horrible, they would be freed. Their punishment? To eat the cooked body of their leader. Some of the rebels refused to eat and were immediately cut down. The rest, well, the gathered crowd could only gasp as they earned their freedom in the most gruesome way possible. But even this wasn't the end for the rebel king. The records show that pieces of Doja's body were then sent around Hungary for display, as a warning to all, peasants and educated men alike, that this is what happens when you threaten the feudal order. A message Doja learned in the most brutal way possible.
Russia has always had a reputation for illicit international activity, from sleeper cells to mysterious number stations to outright brazen assassination. If you annoy a Russian political leader enough, you have a decent chance of accidentally falling out of a window and onto some live bullets. And you may have heard of Russian agents of death coming in forms as strange and innocuous as a poison-tipped umbrella. But what about a simple, innocent cup of tea? You're about to hear a story about a high-profile assassination, a deadly and mysterious poison, and one of the most bizarre criminal investigations known to history. A man solving his own murder before he even died. How could a story this fantastical have possibly happened? Let's take a look and find out. Imagine yourself on a normal November day in London, England. You have a decent, uneventful morning. A simple breakfast at home, perhaps a walk outside in the crisp fall air. You have a lunch meeting at a sushi restaurant and then later head over to the Millennium Hotel for yet another meeting at the Pine Bar. You decline the bartender's offer to order a drink. After all, you don't drink alcohol, and you sit down with the two men you have arranged to meet. They seem distracted, sullen even, but blame the behavior on a long flight into the country. They have a pot of tea at the table when you arrive and offer some of the remaining tea to you. You drink several sips but are put off by the bitter taste and decline to finish the cup. The men bid you farewell and you all go your separate ways. 17 days later, you're lying in a hospital bed in severe pain. You experienced intense diarrhea and vomiting and even lost the ability to walk without help before you asked your wife to call you an ambulance. The doctors have diagnosed you with thallium poisoning. However, your symptoms do not completely align with a case of thallium poisoning. You have damage to your bone marrow and gut that is consistent with thallium poisoning, but lack the presence of peripheral neuropathy, pain and numbness in the fingers and feet, which is a key indicator of this ailment. The doctors are baffled by your case, and the British police are just as confused by your condition and apparent poisoning. Only you have an idea of what could have happened. You believe that you've been assassinated, and you're correct. Soon, with the help of the authorities, you'll solve your own murder from your hospital bed. This is exactly what happened to Alexander Litvinenko in November of 2006, and it's just the tip of the deadly iceberg. Alexander Litvinenko was a former member of the Russian Federal Security Service who fled Russia to seek political asylum in the United Kingdom, which he was granted. He was a vocal critic of Vladimir Putin and referred to his rise in power as a coup, drawing a great deal of negative attention from Putin. He left Russia in 2000, and in 2003 he began working with MI6 as an agent and an expert on organized crime in Russia. He provided MI6 with intelligence about the Russian mafia presence in Spain. This activity likely reached officials within the Russian government who were already not great fans of Litvinenko and who had close ties with the Russian mafia. In the weeks leading up to his assassination, there was a plan in place for Litvinenko to testify before a Spanish prosecutor about the influence of the Russian mafia. This is likely what placed a target on his back and led to his assassination at the hands of Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. They poisoned Litvinenko not with thallium as his doctors initially thought, but with polonium-210, a rare, deadly, nearly undetectable radioactive isotope. Before we learn more about Alexander Litvinenko's assassination and how he solved it, we must discuss polonium-210 and what it does to the human body. Polonium is one of the rarest elements in the world, rightfully referred to by Kovtun as a very expensive poison. It was first discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898. Polonium is so toxic to the human body that a fatal dose would only need to be about the size of a speck of dust. That's all that it would take. Once a person has ingested the polonium, radiation poisoning begins to set in. Nausea, hair loss, swelling of the throat, and the breakdown of the immune system are all symptoms of exposure to polonium. After long enough, it causes organ failure and seeps into the bone marrow. Eventually, it causes cardiac arrest and death. Not only is it deadly, but polonium is very difficult to detect, making it a perfect murder weapon. Litvinenko's doctors not only determined a correct diagnosis of polonium-210 poisoning by testing his urine for the isotope on the day of his death, but then, of course, it was much too late. However, before he died, Litvinenko was able to aid in the investigation into his own murder. Very few people get the opportunity to solve their death before it happens, but Alexander Litvinenko was a brilliant man who understood that there were many people out there who wanted to kill him. He also knew that if he had been assassinated, there were only 3 men that could have done it. He met with 3 men on the day that he was poisoned, and it had to be one of them. First, he met with an Italian associate of his, Mario Scaramella, for lunch. After lunch, he met with Lugovoy and Kovtun at the Millennium Hotel. Litvinenko described this meeting in detail to Detective Inspector Brent Hyatt of Scotland Yard in an interview. He was greeted by Lugovoy upon entering the Pine Bar. Lugovoy then led him to a table that was already covered with mugs and a pot of tea. Litvinenko did not drink alcohol, so the 2 men did not attempt to ply him with something stronger than the tea at the table. Then Lugovoy told Litvinenko that he was leaving, and there was tea left in the pot if he wanted to drink it. Litvinenko poured himself some tea from the pot and drank it. In his account, Litvinenko told Hyatt that he had only a few sips and that the tea tasted off to him. He also noticed that Lugovoy did not drink any tea while sitting at the table. They were then joined by Kovtun. Litvinenko knew, even as he was leaving the hotel, that something was off about the meeting. He told Detective Inspector Hyatt later on, when I left the hotel, I was thinking there was something strange. I had been feeling all the time. I knew that they wanted to kill me. Litvinenko made for an excellent witness, even as he lay dying in the hospital from an as-yet unknown poison. He gave 18 interviews to the detectives assigned to his case, spanning a total of nearly 9 hours. His experience with investigations gave him a great memory, and he pointed the detectives in the direction of Lugovoy and Kovtun. He gave the police his email, his bank account, and a full account of his history with the Russian Federal Security Service, as well as explaining why these men might want him dead. With his help, the police began to piece together a clearer picture of what had happened to Alexander Litvinenko on November 1, 2006 at the Millennium Hotel. The investigation uncovered information that indicated that, contrary to what was believed, November 1st was not the first attempted assassination of Litvinenko. A radiation stain was found in a cup left over from a business meeting between Lugovoy and Litvinenko in October, but because Litvinenko didn't drink any of the liquid in his cup, the attempt was unsuccessful, so the fateful Millennium Hotel meeting was set up. Lugovoy told detectives that he arrived at the hotel for the meeting at 4 p.m. However, when CCTV footage was checked, it was revealed that he arrived at 3:32 p.m., a half hour earlier than reported. He disappeared into the men's bathroom, then emerged. At 3:45 p.m., Kovtun arrived at the hotel and did the same. Later tests showed a massive amount of radiation contamination in one of the bathroom stalls, as well as under the bathroom's hand dryer. These readings were so high that they were off the scale, indicating that Kovtun and Lugovoy were likely preparing the polonium in the restroom somehow. At the very least, they had polonium on their hands when they went into the restroom, and it could not have come from anyone else at that hotel. Litvinenko never went into the hotel bathroom while there, so he could not be the source of of the polonium contamination found inside. When Litvinenko arrived, the pot of tea was already on the table, and his fate was already sealed. It is not certain which man put the polonium in the teapot, but whoever did, the tea was contaminated, and the few sips that Litvinenko took before giving up on the unpleasant-tasting tea were enough to kill him. When the forensics team investigated the Pine Bar, checking tables, cups, spoons, saucers, teapots, and milk jugs, they found the teapot that Litvinenko was served from. Lugovoy and Kovtun clearly didn't care if their assassination attempt put others in harm's way, as the polonium was spread throughout the kitchen and dozens of unsuspecting people exposed. Polonium contamination was found in the bar's dishwasher, the floor, an ice cream scoop, a chopping block, chairs, the piano stool. However, as dangerous as it is, polonium's tendency to stick around on items and provide detectable radiation readings allowed the police to connect it back to Lugovoy and Kovtun. The teapot that Litvinenko drank from gave off a reading of 10,000 becquerels of polonium, and the table where the three men sat indicated radiation levels of 20,000 becquerels, or twice the strength it would take to kill a person if ingested. Even more damning than the evidence found in the bar, however, was the evidence found in Kovtun's hotel room, room 382. While the room was being investigated, the forensics team took apart the bathroom sink. Inside the sink's waste pipe, they found a strange clump that tested for 390,000 becquerels of polonium. This clump had to have come into direct contact with the polonium itself, rather than just traces of it. With this information, the picture came into sharp focus. After the meeting with Litvinenko, Kovtun went to his hotel room and dumped the rest of the polonium down the bathroom sink, hoping to dispose of the murder weapon once and for all. However, in spite of this damning evidence, Kovtun and Lugovoy were already back in Russia, out of the reach of the British justice system. Though Lugovoy and Kovtun were directly responsible for his death, Litvinenko blamed another loftier figure for the decision to have him killed. He named Putin in his final statement before his death, saying, "This may be the time to say one or two things to the person responsible for my present condition. You may succeed in silencing me, but that silence comes at a price. You have shown yourself to be as barbaric and ruthless as your most hostile critics have claimed. You've shown yourself to have no respect for life, liberty, and any civilized value. You have shown yourself to be unworthy of your office, to be unworthy of the trust of civilized men and women. You may succeed in silencing one man, but the howl of protest from around the world will reverberate, Mr. Putin, in your ears for the rest of your life. May God forgive you for what you've done, not only to me, but to beloved Russia and its people." He also agreed to have his photograph taken as he sat in bed, bald and gaunt from radiation poisoning, so that the world could see what was done to him for the mere act of speaking up and speaking out. Even as he was sick, weakened from the poison, he stared defiantly down the lens of the camera, strong until the end. The image circulated around the world, accompanying his story and his message. When the British police named Kovtun and Lugovoy as prime suspects in the murder of Litvinenko, they had not been able to extradite them from Russia. Both men denied their involvement in Litvinenko's death, but Litvinenko's accounts of events and the evidence speaks for itself. Even if they're never truly brought to justice directly, Alexander Litvinenko made sure that the world would know who killed him.
A woman was killed on an empty train car, with no one else going in or out. A mysterious, deadly illness that defies diagnosis. A missing man was found at the top of a 10-foot pile of coal. In each case, someone died, but the exact circumstances of their death defy explanation. Was it an assassin? Alien abduction? No one can say for sure, but many have certainly tried. Today, we're taking a look at some of the most bizarre, compelling, mysterious deaths that we just can't explain. Number 1. Alexander the Great. Alexander III of Macedon, also known as Alexander the Great, conquered lands from Macedonia to Egypt, Greece, and parts of India. But he couldn't conquer whatever mysterious health condition killed him at the age of 32. After returning to Babylon from an unsuccessful campaign in India, Alexander was not feeling great. After a night of drinking, he came down with a fever that grew worse and worse as the days wore on. Eventually, all he could do was lie in bed. 10 days after the fever first came on, he was dead. Other accounts report a sudden sharp pain in his abdomen, and most accounts agree that Alexander's body did not show any signs of decay for 6 days after his death. To witnesses at the time, this was evidence that Alexander was more than a mere man, and he possessed some godlike powers. Today, his death is the source of spirited debate among medical professionals and historians. At the time of his death, no one suspected Alexander was poisoned. However, he had accumulated plenty of enemies during his lifetime, any of whom might have had good reason to poison him. Graham Phillips suggested in his book, Alexander the Great: Murder in Babylon, that it could be strychnine poisoning. However, this poison does not cause a fever and causes convulsions, which were not described in any accounts of Alexander's death. Leo Shep suggested hellebore, which could have been mixed with wine. Some historians have suggested necrotizing pancreatitis, while others have brought up the possibility of West Nile virus or malaria, which he could have picked up on his travels. There is one other potential explanation that has gained traction in recent years, one that would be especially troubling. Dr. Catherine Hall, a senior lecturer at the Dunedin School of Medicine at the University of Otago, New Zealand, proposed that the paralysis described during his illness is indicative of Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disorder. She additionally raised the possibility that as the paralysis progressed, his breathing became less apparent. This led to his doctors declaring him dead, when according to her theory he was still alive. She believes that he may have been alive during those 6 days during which he did not show any signs of decay. His death may have been the most famous case of pseudo-thanatos, or false diagnosis of death, ever recorded. Number 2. Natalie Wood. Hollywood is filled with mysteries that rival those seen on the silver screen. One of the most enduring Hollywood mysteries is the death of the beloved actress Natalie Wood. On November 29, 1981, the 43-year-old Natalie Wood was found floating face down in the ocean off the coast of Catalina Island. At the time, the death was ruled accidental, attributed to a combination of drinking and her inability to swim. However, in 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation after years of speculation that her death could have been the result of a homicide. In 2013, her cause of death was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. Some of the details that muddied the waters of her death included bruises on her arms and knees, as well as a scratch on her neck, indicating she might have been attacked before she drowned. It is also difficult to get a clear picture of the events of November 28, 1981, with conflicting statements regarding whether she had argued with her husband, Robert Wagner, on the yacht where she was last seen before disappearing. Some detectives had suggested that Wagner knew more about the incident than he let on while talking to authorities, but his attorney has vehemently denied this, despite the new concerns raised by the reopened investigation and a great deal of pressure from the true crime enthusiasts. The department was not able to determine whether Natalie Wood's death was indeed the result of a crime or just a tragic accident. Number 3. Zygmunt Adamski. In June 1980, a 56-year-old miner named Zygmunt Adamski vanished from his home in Tingley, West Yorkshire. 5 days later, Adamski's body was found at a coal yard in Todmorden, 5 miles from his home. The body was on top of a 10-foot-high pile of coal, and he was wearing a suit, but his shirt, watch, and wallet were missing. His hair had been cut short, but the most unusual thing about Zygmunt Adamski's body was that it was covered in burn marks on the head, neck, and shoulders. The burns were covered in some sort of ointment, but their exact nature could not be identified. Alan Godfrey, the police officer who arrived on the scene, said that Adamski's face was frozen in an expression of absolute horror. Those eyes were staring up at me. I was looking down on him from a foot away. Those eyes sent a shudder down my spine. They were wide open. He had the look of someone who had seen something or someone that had scared him to death. According to BBC Inside Out, James Turnbull, the coroner who examined Adamski's body, considers it to be the biggest mystery of his career. One of the most bizarre aspects of the body, aside from its location and the burns, was the fact that Adamski had only 1 day's worth of beard growth, despite having been missing for 5 days. The case was filled with unanswered questions and riddles that would never be solved. Where was he when he was missing? What killed him? And how did he get on top of that coal pile? Some blamed Adamski's family, others pointed their fingers at the KGB. There were even those who attributed the disappearance and death to alien abduction. Whether Adamski was taken by foreign intelligence, an ordinary enemy, or something altogether inhuman, we will likely never know exactly what happened. Number 4. Dr. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler. In the early hours of the morning on New Year's Day, 1963, 2 boys were walking near the Lane Cove River in Sydney, Australia, and spotted a man lying face down on the ground. At first glance, they thought he was just another partygoer from the night before who had a bit too much to drink and passed out. But when they walked by the area again an hour and a half later, they saw that his face had turned purple. They called the police, who arrived on scene to find the man naked from the waist down, with his suit trousers placed over his lower half and covered by a carpet. His name was Dr. Gilbert Bogle, and he was dead. 10 meters away on the riverbank, they found another half-naked body, this one belonging to a woman named Margaret Chandler. Both pairs of underwear were found nearby, Margaret and Dr. Bogle had clearly come here together. This was rather scandalous as the two were married, and not to each other. The authorities had never seen anything like this, a couple sneaking off to the lover's lane by the river, getting halfway undressed, and then being interrupted by something that left them both dead. Neither of them were injured, and nothing unusual turned up in the autopsy. No distinct cause of death could be determined, leaving the authorities with their best guess. Suspicion first fell on Jeffrey, Margaret's husband, but not only did they turn out to have an open marriage, but he was with his own girlfriend all night. The presence of vomit and excrement near the body suggested poison might have played a part, and that the burden of finding some evidence fell on the toxicologist. But they could not determine anything other than one fact. Whatever killed one killed the other, and at the same time. The 2006 documentary Who Killed Dr. Bogle and Mrs. Chandler suggested another possibility: asphyxiation from hydrogen sulfide in the river. This toxic gas, which was emanating from the mud due to the dumping of waste in the area, was identified by a Maritime Services Board called to investigate the pollution. The gas is heavier than air, and it would have been more present at ground level. If someone was lying in it, they could asphyxiate and die without realizing what was happening. Still, that's just one theory of many, and the precise cause of Bogle and Chandler's deaths may never be uncovered. Number 5. Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart is one of the most famous pilots and women in history. She's remembered for her aviation records and for being the first female pilot to fly alone across the Atlantic Ocean. Unfortunately, that's not all she's famous for. On June 1, 1937, she and her navigator Fred Noonan left Oakland, California for their transcontinental flight. While flying over the Pacific Ocean, Earhart and Noonan's plane disappeared. No one could locate any trace of them or their plane, and Earhart was declared dead on January 5, 1939. No definitive conclusions about Earhart's fate have ever been reached, but of course there have been plenty of theories, some more realistic than others. One theory posits that Earhart was a spy for the US government and was taken prisoner by Japanese forces while trying to collect intelligence. Another more widely accepted theory is that Earhart and Noonan reached the island of Nikamororo and died there. A heel from a woman's shoe, an aluminum panel, and a piece of curved glass have all been found on the island. These might have belonged to Earhart and her plane, but we may never know for sure. Number 6. Charles Francis Hall. In 1870, Charles Francis Hall led an expedition to the North Pole. The team received $50,000 from Congress, and their ship Polaris left Connecticut on July 3, 1871. As the ship continued north, tensions brewed among the crew, particularly between Hall and the sailing master, Sidney Buddington, as well as a doctor and natural scientist, Emil Bessels. In October, Polaris came to a stop. In November, after a 2-week scouting expedition, Hall returned to the ship and drank a cup of coffee. He quickly became ill and accused the other officers of poisoning him. On November 8th, he was dead, buried in a shallow grave. The remaining crew would never reach the North Pole as Captain Buddington had run the Polaris aground. After the crew members returned to New York, the Navy Board of Inquiry investigated Hall's death and determined that he had died of apoplectic seizure. But in 1968, Chauncey C. Loomis, who was writing a biography of Hall at the time, traveled to his grave. There, he was able to take samples of hair and fingernails and have them tested. The tests showed an intake of considerable amounts of arsenic by C.F. Hall in the last 2 weeks of his life. Loomis wrote that if Hall was murdered, Emil Bessels is the prime subject. However, arsenic was also found in many medicines during that time period, and it's entirely possible that if Hall was poisoned, he unknowingly did it to himself. In both cases, those ifs are doing a lot of heavy lifting. Number 7. Dyatlov Pass Hikers. On January 23, 1959, 10 hikers led by Igor Dyatlov trudged into the Ural Mountains in Russia. One of them had to turn back after a medical emergency, but the remaining 9 continued, planning to send word back after 3 weeks. On February 20th, no one had heard from the group, and a search party was sent out to look for them. When the search party finally tracked down the missing hikers, they found a gruesome scene. 5 of the hikers' bodies were spread out across the snow in various states of undress. One was missing part of his own knuckle, which appeared to have been bitten off, perhaps self-inflicted. After the snow melted, the final 4 bodies were found. Their injuries were equally bizarre. One of the hikers had a twisted neck, one had a fractured skull, 2 were missing their eyes, and 1 was missing her tongue. It was clear at first glance that they had died from hypothermia, and the snow that had collapsed their tent was from some sort of compelling natural force. But the plot soon thickened. Some of the hikers' clothing contained traces of radiation.
leading some to speculate that weapons testing had been involved in the disaster that killed them. Other theories have included the CIA, the FBI, Yetis, aliens, but the most plausible theory, a slab avalanche that fell on the tent. However, slab avalanches usually occur at steeper inclines than the one in Dyatlov Pass. So even though the slab avalanche theory is a compelling possibility, the case is far from closed. Number 8. Letitia Thoreau. Fans of the murder mystery genre might be familiar with the trope of the locked room murder, which, as the name implies, occurs in a locked room with no apparent way for the killer to get in or go out. It's ordinarily the stuff of fiction. But in 1937, the Paris Metro's first-class car saw a locked room murder that was all too real. Letitia Thoreau was a 29-year-old Italian immigrant who had lived in Paris for over a decade. She was a widow who had once been married to a high-society man, Jules. Jules kept her a secret during their 6-year marriage, and his parents only learned of her existence after his death. Letitia had secrets of her own, too. She was a double agent, working with the Paris police to infiltrate La Cagoule, a fascist terrorist group. Before her death, La Cagoule began to expect Letitia was a mole. On her last night alive, Letitia boarded the Paris Metro for the ride home, sitting alone in a first-class car at the Porte de Charenton station. The next stop, Porte Doré, was 45 seconds away. By the time the train reached that stop, Letitia Thoreau was on death's door. She was on the floor with a 9-inch knife in her neck and died on the way to the hospital. According to the train driver, she was the only one in the metro car. It is possible that La Cagoule sent Jean Filiol, one of their assassins, after her. But if that was the case, how did he get into the train car without being seen, stab her in the neck, and escape, all in only 45 seconds? It's like something out of an Agatha Christie novel, but without Hercule Poirot arriving to provide a neat explanation before the final page. Number 9. Elisa Lam. Few modern unsolved deaths have drawn as much wild speculation as the tragic disappearance of Elisa Lam. On January 31, 2013, the 21-year-old Elisa Lam vanished from the infamous Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. When her parents didn't hear from her, they contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. No one could find any trace of Elisa until they checked the security footage. The video showed Elisa acting strangely in one of the hotel's elevators. She stepped into the elevator and pushed all of the buttons, and then began to step in and out of the elevator, peeking out into the hallway. In the final part of the footage, she could be seen standing near the left side of the door, gesticulating wildly and appearing to have an intense conversation with someone who was not in the frame. 2 weeks after the video was published, hotel guests began to complain about low water pressure and a strange, unpleasant taste in the tap water. A maintenance worker named Santiago Lopez investigated the source of the problem and found Elisa Lam's body floating in a hotel water tank. Her death was ruled an accidental drowning, but many questions were left unanswered. How did she get into the tank in the first place? Was she alone? The autopsy did not show any signs of foul play, and it's highly possible that Elisa was suffering from a mental health crisis. But it would have taken a great deal of effort for her to wind up in a water tank if the drowning was self-inflicted. To reach the tank that she was found in, Lopez had to take the elevator to the 15th floor and walk up a staircase to the roof. He had to turn off the rooftop alarm and climb onto a platform where the water tanks were kept. Next, he had to climb another ladder to reach the top of the main tank. It would have been difficult for Elisa to reach this location without setting off an alarm or drawing any attention to herself. Elisa Lam's death is far from the only dark mystery attached to the Cecil Hotel. The building has seen more than its fair share of deaths and supposed hauntings, as well as serial killers, such as Richard Ramirez. The story of Elisa Lam is one of the many horrors seen by the Cecil Hotel that will likely never be explained. Number 10. The South Pole Poisoning. In May of 2000, a 32-year-old astrophysicist named Rodney Marks was walking from a research building to the main base of the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station when he suddenly began to have difficulty breathing. His vision began to blur, and he felt a rush of intense fatigue. He went to bed hoping a good night's sleep would help. But at 5:30 a.m., he woke up vomiting blood. Throughout the day, his symptoms only worsened, his joints ached, his eyes were incredibly sensitive to light, and he became increasingly distressed to the point of hyperventilation. The station doctor gave him an antipsychotic to calm down. It didn't help. Marks went into cardiac arrest and was declared dead at 6:45 p.m. on May 12, 2000. Dr. Thompson believed the death to be the result of unknown but natural causes. The rest of the researchers at the base would have to wait until the body could be collected for an autopsy
if they wanted more answers. Marks's body was kept in the base's storage where the cold preserved the condition of the corpse. On October 30th, a plane was finally able to carry the body to Christchurch, New Zealand, where Dr. Martin Sage performed an autopsy. It was then that he made a startling discovery. Marks had not died of natural causes. He had ingested 150 milliliters of methanol, a sweet, colorless, and toxic type of alcohol used to clean scientific equipment at the base. The dose he had consumed was fatal. This left only a few possibilities, none of them pleasant. Marks could have killed himself, but his colleagues rejected that notion. But if he hadn't poisoned himself, then someone else was responsible. In 2008, coroner Richard McElrea released a report that said it could not be determined one way or another whether the death was the result of foul play. Marks had no enemies at the station, as far as anyone knew, nor did he have a reason to attempt suicide. No suspect has ever been identified, and Antarctica remains a continent that has never seen a murder trial. Number 11. Karen Silkwood. On November 13, 1974, Karen Silkwood was discovered deceased in her car near Crescent, Oklahoma. Silkwood, a chemical technician and an advocate for labor unions, appeared to have collided with a culvert, resulting in her death. Initially deemed a straightforward case of falling asleep at the wheel, questions lingered. Silkwood had been employed at the Kerr-McGee Cimarron fuel fabrication site, where she manufactured plutonium pellets for nuclear reactor fuel rods. Concerned about workplace safety, she joined the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. In July 1974, she discovered she had been contaminated with plutonium, and it turned out that she was the only person in her lab to test positive. Convinced this was no coincidence, she delved deeper into Kerr-McGee's practices, uncovering health violations, worker contamination, and unsafe equipment. Amid mounting stress, her doctor prescribed Quaaludes. Undeterred, Silkwood persisted in her efforts to expose corruption within the company. On November 5, 1974, during a routine self-check, she found almost 400 times the legal limit of plutonium in her body. She was sent home, and her plutonium levels continued to rise. The company accused Silkwood of poisoning herself, and an investigation found high levels of radiation in her home. Silkwood was terrified, believing that the company was trying to kill her. On November 13th, she drove to Oklahoma City and met with New York Times journalist David Burnham, as well as a union leader. She had a binder full of evidence which she took with her on her way to a union meeting. She was finally going to blow the whistle on Kerr-McGee, but she never got the chance. After her crash, the documents had seemingly vanished from the car. Police determined that Silkwood was asleep at the wheel and under the influence of Quaaludes, but her family, friends, and private investigators disagreed, pointing to skid marks as evidence that she was awake during the crash. The precise details of Silkwood's death, and whether it was a drug-induced accident or corporate assassination, are unknown to this day. Number 12. Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue is regarded by many as the first detective story. His writing is famous for spinning dark tales of death, vengeance, and mystique. However, there is one mystery associated with Poe that he had no hand in writing: his own death. On October 3, 1849, Poe arrived at a Baltimore tavern looking worse for wear. He was dazed and confused, dressed in what appeared to be someone else's clothes. A local doctor was notified, and Poe was admitted to a nearby hospital. He was delirious, hallucinating, and calling out for a still unidentified Reynolds. On October 7th, he died, and a Baltimore newspaper reported his cause of death as congestion of the brain. This is just vague enough of an explanation to invite numerous theories in the years since his death. Some believe that his death was alcohol-induced. Biographer E. Oak Smith posed a theory in 1867 that Poe was beaten until he suffered from swelling of the brain. In 1999, public health researcher Albert Donay proposed that Poe died from carbon monoxide poisoning, caused by the coal gas used for indoor lighting in the 19th century. In a similar vein, Chris Sempner, curator of the Poe Museum in Richmond, has suggested mercury poisoning as a possibility, which would explain Poe's hallucinations prior to death. Other popular theories include a brain tumor, influenza, and even murder at the hands of his fiancée's brothers. While some theories have gained more traction than others, it is likely that the mystery of Poe's death shall be solved nevermore. Number 13. Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. It was January 1947, at around 10 in the morning, and Betty Bersinger was pushing her daughter's stroller through Leimert Park in Los Angeles when she stumbled onto a horror show. There was a naked woman's body cut at the waist, lying on the ground next to the sidewalk. The sides of her mouth were carved into a permanent smile.
An autopsy determined that the woman had died from blows to the face and blood loss. The cuts to her face and bisection of her torso mercifully had happened after her death. The woman was identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, known to some as the Black Dahlia, a reference to her love of black dresses and the recent film The Blue Dahlia. The name quickly caught on, and soon the press was spreading the word about the Black Dahlia murder. The police found it difficult to pin down a subject. One potential killer, Robert Manley, had an alibi that checked out. Then an envelope containing Short's belongings, such as her birth certificate, social security card, and address book, was mailed to the examiner's office. A botched investigation of another suspect, Leslie Dillon, led to a lawsuit against the city. Dozens of writers and amateur sleuths had attempted to crack the case over the years, but Elizabeth Short's killer, the person capable of committing such a brutal crime and staging that horrific display, has never been found. Number 14. Lily Lindstrom and the Atlas Vampire. We've seen unsolved deaths surrounded by speculation about ghosts, aliens, even a Yeti. But what about a vampire? Odd as it may seem, the details of one infamous unsolved Swedish murder earned it the nickname the Atlas Vampire Murder. In 1932, a concerned woman named Minnie Jansen called the police about her downstairs neighbor, Lily Lindstrom. She hadn't heard from Lily and was growing concerned. Lindstrom was a sex worker who saw clients in her apartment, and Minnie was worried something terrible had happened. Unfortunately, she was right. When the police entered the apartment, they found Lily naked, face down on the bed, and dead. The cause of death was from head trauma with repeated blows from a blunt object. That was bad enough, but most of Lily's blood had been drained from her body. Saliva was found on the neck and the body, and that, along with a blood-stained ladle, led authorities to fear that the assailant had decided to drink Lily's blood. Authorities interrogated her clients, but none confessed, and they never found her killer or what happened to all that blood. Number 15. JonBenet Ramsey. One of the most shocking murder cases in recent history is that of 6-year-old pageant princess JonBenet Ramsey, who was found strangled to death on December 26, 1996. From the beginning, the case has been shrouded in mystery. On the night of JonBenet's death, the only people known to be in the house with her were her parents, John and Patricia, and her older brother, Burke, who was 9 years old at the time. When the family woke up the morning after Christmas Day, Patricia, also known as Patsy, claimed to find a ransom note written in Sharpie. It demanded a ransom of $118,000 in exchange for JonBenet. The note was highly unusual as far as ransom notes go. First of all, the monetary amount named in the note precisely matched the amount awarded in a recent bonus of John's. That note was longer than most ransom notes and filled 3 pages. After searching the house, John found JonBenet's body. The Ramseys had woken up to a kidnapping and discovered a murder instead. The murder of JonBenet Ramsey has never been solved. Over the years, numerous suspects have been proposed, from her family members to some sort of mystery assailant that broke into the house. According to People, in 2008, the district attorney wrote to John to inform him that he, Patsy, and Burke had been cleared of suspicion via DNA evidence. However, the DA that followed him, Stan Garnett, told People, "I didn't feel the exoneration was warranted based on the state of the evidence and the complexity of the case." Other theories point to the ransom note and the potential for a killer from outside the Ramsey family. One suspect was Michael Helguth, whose boots seemed to match a print found at the scene of the crime. However, Helguth died by suicide in 1997, and that particular trial went cold. Several individuals have attempted to confess to the crime, but no solid evidence has linked them to the murder. There are hopes that advances in DNA-based investigation may eventually lead to an answer, but it's entirely possible that the murder of JonBenet will never be solved. Number 16. 8-Day Bride. Weddings are meant to be joyous occasions, a celebration of love, and the start of a lifelong commitment between two people swearing to cherish one another. But for some couples, till death do us part comes true far too soon. Jack and Christina Kettlewell were married in secret on May 12, 1947. Christina's family did not approve of the match and were even more concerned when Jack's best friend Ronnie accompanied the couple on their honeymoon. On May 17th, Christina and Jack moved into a cottage in Severn Falls, Ontario. 3 days later, only 8 days after the wedding, Christina was found in her pajamas, floating face down in 9 inches of river water. She had drowned. Behind her, the cottage was going up in flames. There were no visible wounds or burns on Christina's body to suggest a struggle or that she had been caught in the fire.
Suspicion immediately fell on Ronnie, who had taken out life insurance policies on both Jack and Christina prior to their elopement. The plot thickens when Jack gives a statement to the police that suggests that he and Ronnie are lovers, and the tale only got more twisted from there. A suicide letter emerged, supposedly written from Christina to Ronnie, claiming that she had tried to kill herself with poison out of fear that she and Jack would never marry. There was another letter that grew more frantic, and finally a third letter written the day before her death. Ronnie is in the boat outside somewhere, it said. By the time he gets back, everything will be all over with. He must have been afraid something would happen because he is staying an extra day to ensure we return to Toronto with him. Jack's son, Richard, never believed this version of the story. He insisted that Ronnie had been the mastermind of a scheme to get rid of Christina. The jury in the case was unable to determine whether foul play was responsible for her death, and the case was left open. The only 3 people who can say for sure what happened that day are dead and buried now, and the truth is buried with them. Number 17. Roland T. Owen, aka Artemis Ogletree. On January 2, 1935, a man checked into room 1046 of the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. He gave the name Roland T. Owen and carried no luggage. He was in his mid-20s, approximately 5 foot 5 inches tall, and had dark hair and a scar over his left eyebrow. There was nothing especially remarkable about him. The next morning, the hotel staff received a call from his room reporting an injury. When they got there, Roland T. Owen was bound and bruised, lying naked on the bed. He was covered in cuts and other injuries consistent with a savage beating, and the room was littered with broken glass and overturned furniture. He was still alive and was taken to the hospital immediately. He refused to share any information about what had happened to him, but by the next day, he was dead. Shortly after, the police determined that Roland T. Owen was a fake name, and the home address he had given was actually the address of a vacant lot. Eventually, after his mother Ruby saw an article about the case, the mysterious dead man was identified as Artemis Ogletree. Strangely enough, Ruby had been receiving letters from her son, some that had been sent after his death. She'd already suspected something was wrong, as the letters had been typed on a typewriter and written in a style that sounded nothing like Artemis. But now she knew for sure. What she didn't know was who might have the reason to kill her son. Some investigators proposed that it might be related to an engagement that he had broken off. Others theorized that Ogletree had ties to the mafia. Nearly a century later, we still have no idea what exactly happened in that hotel room. There is something especially terrifying about the unknown. The world is filled with many horrors, many of which we can explain. Knowing the explanation doesn't make them less horrifying, but it provides some closure. The truth may always be just out of reach, but we'll never give up on trying to grasp it. July 19, 1900, a man sits down for his morning coffee and reads his favorite newspaper, the San Francisco Call. He quickly turns to the story of a missing catboat and 2 of its unfortunate occupants. But there's one headline that day that really piques his curiosity. It reads, "Terrible tortures practiced by the Chinese." He pushes his specs up his nose as he reads that nowhere on earth is any country so cruel and so devoted to fearful tortures, and that no place is so adept at devising new forms of martyrdom for the people they hate than in China. He reads on and discovers a slow kind of horror he's never heard about: the Kang. The newspaper article in the San Francisco Call was real, if not more than a little racially biased. Here's another line from that same article. A Chinaman would take no artistic pleasure in anything that killed quickly, or that reached its culmination of pain quickly. His victim must suffer a little more each hour. In that way, he makes his delight last long and can keep a whole string of wretches to charm him by their slow dying for months. Yes, that part was unashamedly racist, and perhaps the writer was not too well read on the history of his own ancestors' cruelty. But the Kang was certainly a real thing, and indeed it could have been a long drawn-out punishment. It might have sometimes ended in death, but as you'll see today, it took on lots of forms. Let's talk about perhaps the most basic form first, something you could find in China around the time the article was written. If you've ever seen the stocks that they used in Europe and the US back in the day, it looked very similar. The main difference is that even though the offender's head was surrounded by 2 pieces of wooden board fastened together, he or she could actually move a bit more. There were variations on this too, such as sometimes the boards prevented him from getting his hands to his mouth, which meant he could neither eat nor drink by himself. In this case, he had to rely on family or passers-by for their charity. Maybe he could use his hands, but since the boards might weigh as much as 15 kilograms, getting around and living a normal life was not easy in the slightest. The yoke was no joke. As the descriptive writer in that newspaper article wrote, he might be kept in his Kang till madness or death ends his sufferings.
You can only imagine how painful it must have been to be strapped inside one of those things. Sure, the victim might have stayed low to the ground, but for how many weeks can a person do that? The other thing is, this was supposed to be a form of public humiliation, just as the stocks were. And like the victims of the stocks, the public might have been the opposite of charitable. Maybe the man in the kang had stolen from people in the village, or worse, maybe he'd committed a violent crime. What do you think would have happened to him in that case? Yeah, he might have been pelted with rocks and his life might have ended soon after. It goes a long way back too, but we can't say how far back exactly. There's some text from the Great Ming Legal Code of 1397, which states that the victim should be held in the kang in relation to the nature of the crime he's committed. The weight of the kang was also correlated with the gravity of the crime, a crime that would have been stated on paper and nailed to the device. At first, the sufferer might be able to take the weight, but over time, it became hellish. Again, in the words of that news story, in a week the torturers have the felicity of seeing a maddened wretch stumble and fall around blindly, weeping and yelling with anguish. That's if he could eat by himself, or the local people felt sorry enough for him and fed him. If not, his life expectancy in the kang was only a few days, since the lack of water would have killed him. As for lack of food, starvation might have taken a few weeks. On the bright side, a well-liked person in the kang could have been taken care of, and in the end, he might have just lost a bit of face. The newspaper story failed to mention that part. There was also beating by guards that might have happened in the kang, which under the Yuan dynasty by law might have just been with a light stick 7 to 57 times, but it might have also been with a heavy stick 67 to 107 times, which could have resulted in death if a bribe hadn't been paid to lessen the force of the blows. The death would have been slow and usually a result of infected cuts. Remember, this was for lesser crimes too. For example, under the Yuan Code of 1277, 133 offenses could lead to execution, but under the Qing Code of 1740, a whopping 813 offenses merited the death penalty, usually by strangulation or decapitation, and to a lesser extent, slow slicing. With that in mind, kang really was the least of an offender's worries. Believe it or not though, what we've talked about so far is the less brutal form of the kang. We guess it's just a matter of perspective though. Would you prefer the chance to live on or just have your death over and done with quickly? Let us explain. Sometimes the person could move with the kang, but other times the person would have the board fastened around their head and they would also be kept in a kind of wooden cage. Again, this might have happened in a public place as a means to show others what happens if someone created disorder. They might also have been left there until they died. The fear factor was described like this in legal text. If you govern by punishment, the people will fear. Being fearful, they will not commit villainies. There being no villainies, people will be happy. Its reasoning is as old as time, but time has shown us that sometimes the real villains might be the ones doing the punishing. That's why in China, like elsewhere, more barbaric rulers who had a penchant for the cruel and unusual were often replaced with reformists. In this respect, the killer form of the kang might be seen as less brutal than other Chinese punishments in history, such as being cut to pieces, or boiled alive, or being slow-sliced to death. Then there was beheading, which was seen by people in China back in the day as less preferable to hanging. The reason is, a person wanted to keep their head on for the afterlife. This is why the kang in the cage as a slow form of hanging, never mind if it took a long time, might have been a better way to die than a quick chop with the sword. Kang hanging went like this. The offender was placed in the kang, then placed inside the cage. The kang was then attached to the top of the cage. His feet couldn't touch the ground, but he wasn't left just hanging there because supports were placed under his feet. This was supposed to be a slow death, so only little by little were the supports removed, and the pressure on his neck would be incremental until he died. This sounds like something that happened a very long time ago, but it was exactly how some rebels in the 1900 Boxer Rebellion were treated after they were arrested. There's a photo to prove it, with a note saying that it was done to appease foreign powers. The Boxers were not keen on foreigners and certainly Christian missionaries, but it's a complex story we won't get into today. We'll just say that when it came to the kang, this form meant certain death, and it wasn't an express kind of execution. We've also seen other photos, one of them likely taken by a French person because it explains in French that a woman is sentenced to death by strangulation in the kang. Imagine this, you're on your honeymoon in Florida with your now wife, and you have a few hours left before it's time to return to the airport. The sun is shining and the ocean is a magnificent bright blue. You can't resist one last dip in the water before you head home. Besides, none of the photos you've taken so far have quite been profile picture standard. So in you get with your GoPro at the ready. You swim out into the water far enough for nobody else to be in the shot. You hold your breath and you dive down to take that perfect underwater selfie. But little do you realize that a great white shark has just spotted you and is swimming your way right at that moment. You press the shutter and the photo is taken just as the shark is opening its mouth to gobble you up. Your last moments on Earth, captured by a haunting selfie. The photo is uploaded to Facebook automatically. Sounds unbelievable, right? Well, that's because it is. The truth is that Fall Out Boy star Pete Wentz photoshopped a joke photo of him with a shark behind, but a few online media outlets created a fake story using the photo, which ended up going viral. Humans, huh? There's something strangely sadistic about our propensity to laugh at the misery and stupidity of others. I, for one, would never try to gain money and clout by capitalizing on that at the expense of innocent people. Ever. But anyway, what was I saying? Time to laugh at some people who died by taking selfies while they were hanging off of buildings, flying planes, and holding guns. It might not be true that an innocent honeymooner was killed by a shark while taking a selfie, and there's a good reason for that. It would be pretty difficult logistically to not notice the shark coming, and everyone knows we're supposed to fear sharks. Nobody in their right mind would want to take a selfie with one, but what about a more innocent-seeming animal that nobody would suspect, like a penguin or a sloth? Or a walrus. In a Chinese wildlife park, a tourist once tried to take a picture with a walrus but had a nasty surprise. The animal's enclosure turned out to be, well, not very well enclosed, and the 1.5-ton walrus grabbed the man from behind and pulled him into the water to play. Presumably, there was some kind of misunderstanding and the walrus mistook the selfie pose for a "wanna go swimming together" pose? Easy mistake to make. In the walrus's eyes, he was playfully submerging the man and swimming around him. In reality, he was drowning the man and kept him trapped under the water. A zookeeper tried to enter the water to save the man but ended up in the same predicament, and eventually the two of them drowned. He's not the only one to have underestimated the strength of wild animals, an important fact that seems to have been forgotten in modern times. In Pamplona, the home of the ancient Spanish tradition of bull runs, a man thought it'd be a great idea to take a selfie with two bulls about to collide with each other in the background. Unfortunately, he didn't see a third bull running toward him. The third bull pierced the neck of the selfie taker with its horn. Spectators noted he remained suspended in the air like a puppet. The man was one of many to die from taking part in the controversial bull running tradition, but he was the first to meet his demise by taking a photo. Of course, it's not just animals that are putting people at risk. We can do that all by ourselves, thank you very much. For example, a Romanian teenager once tried to lie down on the roof of a train car to take an iconic selfie, but that didn't quite go to plan. As luck would have it, just as she lifted up one of her legs to pose, the leg hit a live wire overhead, resulting in a massive electric shock. An electric fence used to keep horses fenced normally gives out a shock of around 2,000 volts. Strong, but not enough to cause much damage to a human. Well, this wire gave out a shock of 27,000 volts. The girl didn't just get a nasty shock, she literally burst into flames and died of her burns. Thinking they'd be safe if they all just stayed on the ground, a group of young ladies died trying to attempt the so-called daredevil selfie, which involves posing on the railway as a train approaches and then jumping out of the way just in the nick of time, except they didn't get the timing quite right and they all ended up getting run over. If that sounds like the dumbest thing you've ever heard, then you clearly haven't heard about the rest of the incidents in this video. Well, trains are one thing, they don't seem that dangerous. Surely, nobody would be stupid enough to try and take a selfie while in a plane. Wrong. One amateur pilot lost control of his plane one day while flying over Colorado, and his penchant for mid-flight selfies is believed to be the cause. Although the accident itself wasn't recorded, the GoPro camera he used was found the next day, with photos taken at dangerous points in the air featuring both the pilot and his passenger. The flash used for the camera probably disoriented the guy so much that he lost control of the plane, because no other reason for the crash could be found. The crazy pilot isn't the only one who seems to have a screw loose. My legs turn to jelly when I climb up a ladder to clean my windows, but one ex-Chinese stuntman made a habit of ascending high buildings and hanging off of ledges to bring in some extra income. His photos soon went viral, including one of him hanging off the Great Wall of China with a sheer drop below, and another standing casually on top of a huge skyscraper. Unfortunately, one day things didn't go so well. While hanging from the roof of an extremely tall building, the man just couldn't get the perfect shot. There's no use in risking your life by climbing tens of feet up a building just to post a photo with hair in your eyes. He climbed back onto the top of the building and lowered himself back down again successfully twice, but on the third time around, he lost his grip and slipped. Because he was so high up in the first place, he ended up dropping 45 feet down onto another rooftop instead of hitting the ground. He probably didn't die immediately, but by the time anyone found him, it was too late. The whole thing is available on film, but you probably shouldn't watch it unless you're a terrible person. In another case of ignoring all common sense and the human instinct to survive are the people who take selfies with guns. You know, the weapons designed to kill people. In 2016, a 16-year-old boy tried to take a selfie with his father's pistol, but his coordination seemingly betrayed him. He pressed the wrong shoot button, triggering the gun instead of the camera. I'm not sure how you can mess things up that spectacularly, but he was only a boy. Except a middle-aged man made the same mistake. A 43-year-old Washington resident had been entertaining himself by taking photos with an unloaded gun all day. Well, we all unwind in different ways, I guess, and managed to successfully take a good few without shooting himself in the head. However, he must have become overconfident in his ability to remember to remove the bullets, because he eventually took a photo with one bullet left in and killed himself. I'm not sure why he didn't just leave the bullets out permanently, but I don't want to rub salt into the wound. Now, these freak accidents are one thing, but can you imagine selfie-related deaths being such a pandemic that the government has had to release a pamphlet instructing people how to take photos of themselves responsibly? Well, that's what happened in Russia due to a high number of injuries and deaths caused by selfies in 2015. The bizarre poster included instructions not to take selfies with guns or grenades or in front of trains or lions. I know what you're thinking. Who would be stupid enough to do that? Well, actually, a few people. 2 young soldiers in Siberia tried to take a selfie with a live grenade and, well, you can guess what's next. It exploded and killed them both. At least they didn't die in vain. The phone survived with the photo on it. That same year, a Russian teenager with a keen interest in amateur photography tried to take a selfie on a railway bridge in St. Petersburg at night. But while trying to take the photograph, she lost her balance and tried to grab a high-voltage cable on the way down to stop the fall. Instead, it electrocuted her and she fell to the ground, shocking the friend who was waiting for her below. Confusingly, many of the articles regarding the incident published a photo of Angela Nicolau, another Russian woman famous for posting photos of herself on high buildings. So is the whole thing a hoax, or did the press just publish a picture of the wrong girl? Selfie deaths are a confusing beast. Worryingly, Russia isn't even the country that faces the greatest problem with selfie deaths. That honor goes to India. In 2015, around half of all selfie-related deaths happened in India. One man tried to take a selfie from a rock that collapsed beneath his feet, causing him to fall around 60 feet and die instantly from head injuries. Another group died while standing on a boat to pose for photos, only to capsize and drown. The Indian government went so far as to declare selfie fatalities a national pandemic amongst young Indians, and Mumbai police created 16 no-selfie zones in areas deemed to be high risk. It's somewhat ironic, considering India's then Prime Minister Narendra Modi was known for indulging in selfies himself, taking an iconic shot with the then Chinese premier in 2015. It seems that tourists got the selfie bug while visiting the country too. A 66-year-old Japanese tourist once died trying to take a picture with the Taj Mahal. It might sound particularly dangerous, but it ended fatally. The man was trying to take a picture with the iconic site while descending the steps when he lost his balance, fell, and died. He's not the only tourist who's been so desperate for the perfect Instagram shot that they fell to their death. One young woman recently died trying to take a photo at the edge of a cliff in Sydney. The British female ignored the warning signs telling people not to enter the fenced-in cliff area. Maybe she mistook them for Halloween decorations to take a photo by the picturesque waves below. Her friends later realized she was missing and a helicopter recovered her body. A similar thing happened to a Polish couple in Portugal who stepped over safety barriers to get the perfect angle for their dramatic shot, only to end up having a dramatic fall into the Atlantic Ocean. Seriously, people, it's not that hard. Just do what the signs are telling you to. You might be thinking you'd never take a picture from the top of a skyscraper, in front of an animal, or with a gun, so you're safe from this embarrassing cause of death. You'll never have "died from vanity" written across your tombstone. Unfortunately, people have died from taking selfies in even the safest of places. In fact, the first known selfie death happened in a place nobody was expecting it. A few students in Lebanon were hanging out in the street of a safe neighborhood when they decided to take a picture together. No harm there, right? Well, in this case, yes. It seems the boys were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because just as he hit snap, A car bomb went off. The bomb successfully targeted the then president of Lebanon, who died, but these innocent bystanders were also taken out. Just minutes after the original photo was taken, a second photo of the boy lying dead on the floor was taken. Even considering a selfie could put you into danger. A man hiking through the Brecon Beacons mountain range with a selfie stick was struck by lightning, and he may not have died if he'd gone without the ultimate embarrassing tourist accessory, which has a metal arm. There are definitely a few life lessons here. Safety barriers are there for a reason, wild animals are dangerous, and weapons designed for killing really are fatal. I can't believe I'm even having to say this. There's a time and a place for questioning conventional wisdom, kids, but this isn't one of them. If you want to keep learning about people dying in strange ways, then I won't judge you. We made the videos. Depending on what type of person you are, you might be interested in this video about people dying from laughter, or this one about them dying from loneliness.